Hi guys, and welcome to History That Makes You Sleepy tonight. You arrive just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders. Light as snow, but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint, bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause, because something here does not quite make sense. And the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Flow straight into the story. The prairie around you still smoulders in places. Little orange veins glowing faintly beneath blackened grass. The fire passed through only hours ago. You can smell it everywhere. Burned sage, wet ash, charred wood, somewhere nearby. A wagon wheel lets out a soft crack as heated wood cools against the evening air. And unfortunately for you, this is still considered a fairly normal travel day on the American frontier. You stand among a line of covered wagons pulled into a rough circle beside a creek that is almost frozen solid. The emigrant families have stopped for the night because darkness is arriving quickly, and because nobody wants to test half-blind oxen on uneven prairie after a fire. One child coughs somewhere behind a wagon. A tired woman wrings soot from the hem of her dress. An older man pokes cautiously at the ashes with a stick, as if personally offended that the ground tried to burn him today. You begin to notice the wagons themselves. Modern movies tend to imagine them as cozy little wooden houses on wheels. They are not. They are cargo boxes with fabric stretched over bent wooden bows. A typical covered wagon on western trails measured around 10 feet long inside, sometimes less once supplies filled the floor. Historical records from the Oregon Trail describe families of 5 or 6 sleeping together in spaces smaller than a modern garden shed. That sounds charming, right up until somebody's boots freeze against your leg at 3 in the morning. You move closer to one wagon where tonight's sleeping arrangements are already underway. The canvas covering flaps softly in the cold breeze. It smells of dust, mildew, smoke, animal grease, and old rainwater. The scent is strangely heavy, trapped deep in the fibres after months of travel. A boy climbs inside carrying an iron skillet almost as large as his chest. His mother follows with folded quilts, then a bundle of kindling, then a sack of flour, then 2 sleeping children who are already half dreaming before sunset. You quickly realize the wagon is not only a bedroom, it is pantry, closet, tool shed, medicine cabinet, nursery, and occasionally emotional breakdown chamber. A quirky little detail from trail diaries reveals that some emigrants hung cups, spoons, and frying pans directly from wagon bows overhead while they slept. Imagine drifting peacefully into frontier slumber while a metal coffee pot swings gently 6 inches from your forehead like an exhausted pendulum of doom. The camp slowly settles. Oxen grunt in the darkness. Leather harnesses creak. Someone nearby stirs beans in a pot with the kind of determination normally reserved for military engineering projects. Smoke from dozens of weak fires drifts low across the ground because cold air traps it close to earth. You kneel beside one wagon and place a hand against the wheel. The wood feels bitterly cold already. Night on the plains arrives fast after sunset, especially in late autumn. Travelers on the Santa Fe and Oregon trails often describe temperature drops so sudden they seemed unnatural. 1 minute mud, next minute frozen water buckets. The prairie does not negotiate. Inside the wagon, bedding is being arranged carefully. Quilts go down first across supply crates, then buffalo robes, then flattened sacks stuffed with spare clothing. Comfort is relative here. If your shoulder is not resting directly against a wagon axle, you're already ahead of schedule. You climb inside carefully. Your head immediately bumps the curved wooden bow above you. Of course it does. Covered wagons were designed mainly to carry freight, not preserve dignity. You settle awkwardly among flour sacks and rolled blankets, while the canvas walls snap quietly outside. The woman beside you lights a lantern for only a moment before extinguishing it again. Fuel costs money. Darkness is free. That darkness changes everything. Without electric lights, the prairie at night becomes enormous. The black sky stretches endlessly beyond the thin wagon canvas. Wind brushes softly across the fabric overhead. Somewhere in the distance a coyote calls once, then again. A mainstream historical truth often forgotten today is that many emigrants actually slept outside beside the wagons during warmer months. Wagons were so crowded and uncomfortable that open ground sometimes felt preferable. But tonight is too cold for that. Frost already forms along the wagon tongue. You pull a blanket tighter around yourself. The wool scratches your chin. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and animal fat. Across from you, a child sleeps with boots still on because removing frozen boots at night can become an entire tragic side quest nobody wants to experience before dawn. The wagon shifts slightly as somebody climbs in beside you. There is barely room now to move. Your elbow presses against a crate of tools. Your knee rests against bundled clothing. Somewhere under the bedding lies a bag of dried beans, contributing silently but significantly to the overall sleeping geometry. And yet people did this for months. Thousands upon thousands of emigrants crossed North America this way during the 19th century. Some travelled half a year inside these wagons through rainstorms, river crossings, snow, disease outbreaks, and endless wind. Scholars still debate how many emigrants truly understood the physical hardship awaiting them before departure. Promotional guidebooks often painted Western migration as challenging but manageable. Few brochures apparently included detailed descriptions of waking up spooning a sack of onions while frost forms on your eyebrows. Outside, the last conversations fade. You hear soft murmurs, a cough, a horse stamping against frozen earth, then quieter still. The firelight beyond the wagon canvas dims until only faint amber glows remain. Shadows move slowly across the fabric walls like drifting ghosts. The prairie smells colder now, cleaner beneath the lingering smoke. You close your eyes. The wagon creaks gently around you as night settles deeper over the burned grasslands, and somewhere far out beyond the darkness, winter waits patiently for the travellers still crossing its edge. The cold deepens slowly, almost politely at first. You notice it in tiny ways before it becomes impossible to ignore. The wagon canvas stiffens overhead. Your breath lingers longer in the darkness. Fingers that seemed merely cool a few minutes ago now feel strangely wooden, as though they belong to somebody else entirely. Outside, the prairie wind slides across the grass with a long whispering sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady enough to remind you that this wagon is little more than stretched cloth tied over wood, which unfortunately it absolutely is. The family beside you settles into practiced positions. The father removes his boots with a tired sigh that sounds older than he is. His socks steam faintly near the last warmth trapped beneath the blankets. Across from him, his wife rearranges bedding for the third time in 10 minutes because every inch matters tonight. If one quilt edge slips free, somebody wakes up shivering at midnight wondering whether their toes still legally qualify as toes. The youngest child squirms closer against her side. You can hear the soft rustle of straw beneath the blankets. Straw mattresses were common on western trails because they added insulation without much expense. Of course, after weeks of rain, river crossings, spilled food, and sleeping humans, That straw often developed the fragrance profile of damp livestock ambition. Still, nobody complains much. Or rather, nobody complains loudly. Frontier families mastered the art of exhausted silence. The wagon interior smells stronger now that everyone is packed inside. Wool blankets carry traces of smoke and sweat. Damp leather boots sit near the entrance. Somewhere nearby, onions and salt pork contribute aggressively to the atmosphere. You begin to understand why 19th century travellers described wagon camps less as communities and more as slowly moving collections of determined odours. The father reaches overhead and adjusts a lantern hook hanging from one of the wagon bows. Tiny metal objects clink softly together in the darkness. Cups, a spoon, a horseshoe nail tucked away for later repairs. One historical account from the California Trail mentioned emigrants storing bacon strips inside pillowcases during winter travel because the cold preserved them overnight. Imagine drifting peacefully to sleep while your pillow smells faintly like breakfast and existential hardship. The wagon creaks again. Wind presses lightly against the canvas sidewall. And for a moment you feel the full fragility of this little shelter. Outside lies open prairie stretching hundreds of miles beneath freezing stars. Inside lies one wooden box crowded with blankets, tools, food, and breathing bodies trying very hard not to freeze before morning. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders. It helps slightly, only slightly. A widespread historical reality often overlooked today is how few emigrants actually owned proper cold weather gear. Many eastern families heading west packed clothing suited for farms and towns, not open plains winters. Diaries from overland trails frequently mention travellers layering ordinary dresses, coats, shawls, and even curtains together for warmth. Fashion and survival begin merging very quickly once frost enters the conversation. The little girl beside you coughs softly. Her mother rubs her back without speaking. Beyond the wagon, you hear oxen shifting in their harnesses. Bells clink faintly somewhere in the darkness. Then comes the long-distant howl of another coyote. The sound rises and fades across the prairie like smoke drifting over water. You try to stretch your legs. An immediate mistake. Your foot collides with a crate. Your knee bumps the wagon wall. And somewhere in the darkness, a frying pan threatens to fall directly onto civilization. You freeze instantly. So does everyone else. Silence. Then the father mutters something too tired to count as language. Crisis avoided. Barely. Historians still argue how comfortable emigrants expected covered wagon travel to be before departure westward. Some scholars believe many families knowingly accepted the hardship as temporary sacrifice. Others suspect that guidebooks and emigrant advertisements softened reality considerably. After all, come west and sleep diagonally atop potatoes for 6 months is not exactly a winning tourism slogan. Outside, one of the campfires collapses inward with a faint hiss of sparks. The glow filtering through the wagon canvas grows dimmer. That is the truly unsettling part of prairie nights. Fire disappears fast. Once flames die down, darkness becomes almost physical, thick, heavy, endless. You understand suddenly why emigrants often described campfires emotionally, almost affectionately, in diaries. A fire was not merely warmth. It was reassurance, proof that human beings still existed out there, somewhere beyond the Black Prairie. The woman beside you quietly unwraps another blanket from a bundle. Buffalo hide. You can smell it immediately, earthy and musky beneath lingering smoke. Buffalo robes were among the most valuable possessions on many western trails because they trapped heat far better than ordinary wool blankets. Traders along frontier routes sold thousands of them to emigrants heading west. You run your hand lightly across the stiff fur edge. It feels rough but thick, heavy enough to block wind surprisingly well. A curious little frontier rumour claimed that sleeping beneath buffalo robes caused vivid dreams because the hide still carried wild prairie spirits. More practical travellers pointed out that suffocating under 300 pounds of fur and campfire smoke might also explain the hallucinations. The family settles again. One child mumbles in sleep. Someone shifts carefully to avoid waking the others. Wagon wheels outside creak softly as cold contracts the wood. You stare upward toward the faint curve of canvas overhead. Tiny dark stains mark the fabric from months of rain and smoke exposure. One patch has been repaired with mismatched cloth sewn unevenly by hand. Another section flutters slightly whenever stronger wind passes across the prairie. You realize with growing discomfort that the wagon is never truly warm. That is the secret nobody tells you. It can become less cold, protected from wind, sheltered from snow, but genuine warmth remains rare. Human bodies create heat beneath blankets. Yes, but the air itself stays sharp enough to sting your nose each time you breathe. A surviving emigrant diary once described waking to find ice formed along the inside edges of wagon canvas after particularly bitter nights. You glance upward again, and suddenly wish you had not learned that information. The father clears his throat quietly. Then another sound follows. Rain, very light at first. Tiny taps against stretched canvas, barely noticeable. But everyone inside hears it immediately, because rain changes everything. Cold rain means damp blankets, muddy boots, wet bedding, frozen clothing by morning. The entire fragile system balancing comfort and misery begins tipping rapidly toward misery. Nobody speaks for several seconds. Then the mother exhales softly through her nose, the exhausted frontier equivalent of saying, "Oh, wonderful. Exactly what this evening needed." The rain continues. You listen to it drumming gently overhead while the wagon rocks faintly in the growing wind. And beyond the thin canvas walls, the prairie stretches endlessly into darkness, vast and freezing beneath the hidden stars. The rain does not last long. That would almost be comforting if freezing prairie weather were capable of kindness, which it absolutely is not. Instead, the brief shower leaves behind a damp chill that settles into everything. Blankets absorb it. Clothing absorbs it. Even the wagon wood seems to drink it in greedily. The air inside grows colder, heavier somehow, carrying the smell of wet canvas and muddy boots. You shift carefully beneath the buffalo robe. The fur trap's warmth surprisingly well now that everyone has squeezed closer together. Human beings become very practical heaters during frontier travel. Privacy disappears quickly on the trail. Personal space becomes a distant memory from another civilization, like indoor plumbing or soup that does not taste faintly of smoke. Outside, the rain has faded into dripping sounds along the wagon wheels. Water slides from the canvas edges in slow, uneven drops. Somewhere in camp a baby begins crying weakly, then quiets after a woman murmurs softly in the darkness. The prairie night stretches onward. Inside the wagon, sleeping arrangements have finally stabilized into a fragile compromise between comfort and geometry. The father lies nearest the wagon opening in case trouble comes during the night. His boots rest close at hand. One child curls beside his mother under layered quilts. Another sleeps crosswise near the back, feet tucked dangerously close to a crate of tools. And you occupy the narrow remaining strip of space apparently designed for either a traveller or an unusually ambitious loaf of bread. Your shoulder presses against rough wood beneath the bedding. Every few minutes the wagon shifts slightly as somebody adjusts position. Each movement produces tiny sounds, fabric rustling, wooden joints creaking, quiet sighs swallowed by darkness. You begin noticing the cold floor beneath everything. That is one of the great hidden enemies of wagon sleeping. Cold rises constantly from below. Even thick blankets struggle against frozen earth only inches beneath the wagon bed. Emigrants often laid buffalo hides, straw, spare clothing, or brush beneath bedding for extra insulation. A practical solution. though it occasionally meant discovering at dawn that you spent the night directly atop a skillet handle or someone's emergency potatoes. A widely accepted historical fact is that most overland trail wagons carried far more supplies than passengers. Walking beside the wagon remained common during daylight because animals needed the weight reduced whenever possible. Ironically, families spent all day marching across the prairie only to crawl back into cramped wagons at night like exhausted laundry returning to storage. The firelight outside has nearly vanished now. Only tiny orange glimmers flicker through seams in the wagon canvas. The father reaches beneath the blankets and pulls out a pocket watch. He opens it briefly. A tiny metallic click, then silence again. Time behaves strangely out here. Without electric lights or modern noise, night feels much larger than it does today. Hours stretch slowly across the prairie. Every sound carries weight. A coughing ox, wind brushing grass, wagon chains shifting somewhere beyond the darkness. You close your eyes, then immediately open them again because something cold just touched your cheek. Water! A droplet hangs from the inside curve of the canvas overhead. Another forms nearby. Condensation. The warmth from breathing bodies inside the wagon rises upward. Meeting freezing canvas and turning back into water, you watch another drop gather slowly before falling onto a blanket below. Frontier engineering at its finest. The roof politely sweats on you while you attempt unconsciousness. Some travellers reportedly rubbed wagon canvas with linseed oil mixtures, or wax coatings to improve water resistance during bad weather. Others simply accepted moisture as part of frontier existence, alongside dysentery, suspicious coffee, and oxen that occasionally wandered away at midnight for reasons known only to themselves. The little girl stirs beside her mother. Half asleep, she asks whether wolves can climb into wagons. Her father answers immediately, no. A pause. Then more honestly, probably not. You hear the mother suppress a tired laugh beneath her blanket. The child falls asleep anyway. A quirky frontier superstition claimed wolves avoided camps where iron objects hung visibly from wagons. Some emigrants tied horseshoes or tools near wagon entrances for protection. Whether wolves cared about decorative blacksmithing remains uncertain. Historians continue debating how frequently emigrant wagon trains truly faced dangerous animal attacks. Popular stories exaggerated wolf encounters dramatically, but frontier diaries reveal that fear itself remained constant even when actual attacks were rare. The prairie at night simply sounded too large, too empty, too unknown. Wind brushes harder against the wagon now. The canvas walls flex inward slightly before settling back again. You pull the blanket higher. Your nose feels cold. Your fingertips too. But beneath the layered robes and quilts, trapped warmth slowly gathers around everyone sleeping close together. It is not comfortable exactly. More like survivable with effort. The father begins snoring quietly. An impressive achievement considering his left elbow currently rests against a barrel hoop, while his feet appear trapped beneath somebody's laundry sack. You stare upward again at the curved wagon roof. Faint moonlight filters weakly through the canvas now that clouds have broken apart. The light turns the interior pale grey. You can just make out hanging cookware overhead, and the outlines of bundled supplies stacked near the wagon front. Flour sacks, tools, spare wagon parts, a violin case tucked carefully beside a crate. That surprises you. Then again, emigrants carried strange little reminders of ordinary life across the frontier. Books, family portraits, teacups, sewing kits, musical instruments. One emigrant reportedly hauled an entire cast-iron stove hundreds of miles west before abandoning it beside the trail after a river crossing. Somewhere on the plains, future archaeologists probably discovered the world's saddest kitchen renovation project. The wind eases again. Outside, frost slowly forms across blackened prairie grass left behind by the earlier fire. The air smells cleaner now, sharper beneath the lingering smoke. Somewhere distant, Cattle bells clink softly in the darkness. You feel sleep beginning to pull at you. Not gentle modern sleep beneath warm blankets and climate control. Frontier sleep. Heavy. Uneven. Earned through exhaustion more than comfort. Your body finally begins surrendering to it. The wagon rocks faintly as wind crosses the open plains. Nearby breathing rises and falls slowly in the darkness. Condensation taps softly from the canvas roof onto blankets below, like tiny cold clocks measuring out the night. And beyond this fragile little wagon, beyond the exhausted campfires and sleeping oxen, the prairie continues endlessly beneath the frozen stars, patient and silent around the travellers crossing through it. Sometime after midnight, the wind changes its mind about being gentle. You wake without fully understanding why at first. Your eyes open into darkness so complete it feels almost solid. Then you hear it, a long steady push of air sweeping across the prairie. The wagon groans softly in response. Cold slips inside immediately. Not dramatic icy blasts from adventure movies. Worse than that, thin cold, sneaky cold, the kind that finds every seam in the wagon canvas and patiently works through it, until your blankets no longer seem impressive. You tuck your hands deeper beneath the buffalo robe. The warmth trapped there has faded during the night. Not entirely gone, but weaker now. The sleeping bodies around you no longer feel cozy. They feel like fellow survivors sharing limited resources during a very inconvenient experiment. Outside, the oxen shuffle uneasily. Harness chains clink together. One animal snorts sharply into the darkness. You hear the soft flap of loose canvas somewhere farther through camp. Somebody's awake already, moving between wagons with slow, heavy footsteps. The father beside the wagon entrance lifts his head slightly. You can barely see him in the dark, just the outline of his shoulders beneath blankets. He listens. Frontier travellers became experts at listening. Wind sounded different from rain. Rain sounded different from approaching hooves. Hooves sounded different from wandering cattle. Life on the plains trained people to read darkness through sound alone, which honestly feels like a skill modern people would trade immediately for the ability to mute group chats. The wind presses harder again. A cold thread slides across your neck from somewhere near the wagon wall. There, that tiny gap. You had not noticed it before, but now it feels enormous. A narrow opening where canvas ties unevenly against the wooden frame. The cold pours through steadily, touching blankets, cheeks, fingers. The mother notices too. Without speaking, she reaches for an extra piece of cloth from nearby supplies and stuffs it carefully against the opening. The draft weakens slightly. Improvisation like this happened constantly during overland travel. Diaries from emigrants mention plugging wagon gaps with old clothing, spare rags, buffalo fur, even paper when necessary. Covered wagons were durable enough for rough travel, but terrible at sealing out weather completely. Another gust rattles the wagon bows overhead. The curved wood creaks softly like an old ship at sea. You suddenly understand why some emigrants compared prairie travel to ocean voyages. Endless horizon, rolling movement, isolation. The sense that nature remains vastly larger than your fragile vehicle. A curious detail from several trail journals reveals that some travellers carried small feather beds from home, despite the extra weight. Not because feather beds handled frontier conditions well. They absolutely did not. Once wet, they became giant freezing bread loaves of misery. But people missed softness, familiarity, tiny pieces of ordinary life. The little girl near you shifts in her sleep and pulls blankets tighter around her shoulders. Her mother checks her forehead gently. Then the woman glances upward toward the wagon roof. You follow her eyes. Moonlight now filters faintly through tiny needle holes in the canvas. Not damage exactly. Wear. Months of weather slowly thinning the fabric. Each little pinprick glows softly against the darkness. Beautiful in a deeply concerning way. One accepted historical reality. is that wagon canvas required constant maintenance during long journeys. Rain, sun exposure, wind, and friction slowly weakened the material until leaks became unavoidable. Travellers patched holes repeatedly with spare cloth and stitching whenever time allowed. The wagon shifts again, this time from outside. Someone presses briefly against the wheel. A low voice whispers through the darkness, asking whether everything is secure. The father answers quietly. You hear another wagon nearby responding too. Soft voices moving camp to camp through the freezing night like distant lanterns. There is something oddly comforting about it. These travellers depend heavily on one another. Illness, storms, broken axles, river crossings, animal losses. Nobody handles the trail entirely alone for long. Cooperation becomes survival remarkably quickly once the weather begins actively questioning your existence. The wind eases for a few moments. Silence settles again except for breathing and the occasional creak of cooling wood. Then comes another sound. Tiny scratching. You freeze instantly. So does the mother. The sound comes again near the rear supplies. Scratch, rustle, pause. A child opens one sleepy eye. The father slowly reaches for the lantern, but does not light it yet. Instead, he leans carefully across the bedding pile and lifts one floor sack corner. The scratching stops, then suddenly explodes into frantic movement. Something small darts across the wagon floor. The child gasps. The mother mutters under her breath, and a mouse vanishes somewhere beneath the tool crate. Apparently even frontier rodents believed wagon sleeping arrangements could still become slightly more crowded. Trail diaries occasionally mention mice travelling alongside wagon trains, attracted by grain supplies and food scraps. Some emigrants kept cats in wagons specifically for pest control. Imagine being a frontier cat, unlimited mice, endless adventure, occasional buffalo. Honestly, the cats may have been having the best experience out there. The excitement fades quickly. Exhaustion wins again. Nobody even attempts to chase the mouse further. The father settles back beneath the blankets with the calm resignation of a man who no longer negotiates with wildlife after midnight. Outside, frost thickens across the prairie grass. You can smell the cold now. That sharp mineral scent frozen air carries before dawn. Your nose tingles with every breath. Somewhere in the distance, a tree branch cracks loudly in the freezing temperature. Researchers still disagree about how emotionally prepared emigrant families truly were for prolonged exposure to prairie winters. Some letters describe excitement and determination. Others reveal deep loneliness and fear hidden beneath practical daily entries. Many travellers likely experience both simultaneously. You stare upward once more at the dim glowing pinholes in the canvas roof. The wagon feels smaller now. Not unsafe exactly, just temporary and fragile. A moving shelter balanced between endurance and exhaustion. Your shoulder aches from the wooden floor beneath the bedding. Your feet remain cold despite layers of blankets. Every breath carries traces of smoke, damp wool, and freezing air. And yet sleep begins pulling at you again. The human body adapts strangely fast. Even here, even now, outside, the wind continues drifting across the endless prairie while the patched wagon canvas trembles softly overhead, holding back the freezing darkness one thin layer at a time. Long before dawn, somebody outside begins chopping wood. The sound drifts through the sleeping camp in slow, uneven strikes. Crack, pause, crack. Each blow seems strangely muffled by frost and distance, as though the prairie itself feels too tired to echo properly. You wake again beneath heavy blankets. For a few seconds you have no idea where you are. Only darkness, stiff shoulders, cold air touching the edge of your face. Then the wagon smell returns. Smoke, wet canvas, wool, salt pork, human exhaustion. Memory settles back into place. The little campfire outside must have burned down hours ago because the cold inside the wagon has sharpened noticeably. Your breath hangs pale in the dim moonlight leaking through the canvas roof. Nearby, somebody's boots have frozen stiff enough to stand almost upright beside the wagon wall like deeply judgmental leather statues. The father groans softly as he pushes himself upright. You hear joints crack. Frontier travel appears to have aged everyone approximately 12 years by this point. He pulls on his coat slowly, trying not to wake the others, though the wagon immediately announces every movement with creaks and rattles. A hanging spoon taps against metal cookware overhead. Somewhere beneath the bedding, the mouse from earlier resumes its mysterious nighttime career. The father opens the wagon flap briefly. Cold air floods inside so suddenly it steals your breath. You glimpse the camp beyond, tiny fires glowing weakly against black prairie, frost silvering the ground, oxen standing motionless beneath drifting steam from their noses. The stars overhead look impossibly bright in the freezing sky. Then the flap closes again. The warmth trapped inside the wagon feels almost luxurious afterward, despite being approximately equivalent to standing near a mildly enthusiastic refrigerator. You tuck your chin deeper beneath the blanket. Outside, the chopping continues. Fuel mattered constantly on western trails. Travellers burned whatever they could find depending on terrain. Wood near rivers, sagebrush on dry plains, twisted roots pulled from the earth, buffalo chips once trees disappeared entirely across open prairie. Yes, dried buffalo dung became cooking fuel for thousands of emigrants crossing the plains. It burned slowly and surprisingly well. Frontier history contains many moments where survival quietly lowers your standards without asking permission first. The mother wakes next. Unlike the father, she becomes alert immediately. No slow adjustment, no sleepy confusion. 1 second asleep, next second already checking blankets, children, supplies, weather sounds, and probably the emotional stability of the universe itself. She reaches toward a small cloth bundle near the wagon wall and unwraps yesterday's leftover cornbread. Hard as stone now. You could potentially repair roads with this cornbread. Still edible, though, probably. One child stirs beside her. Not fully awake yet. Just enough to mumble complaints about the cold before curling tighter beneath blankets. A small and rather odd frontier habit appears in several emigrant journals. Some travellers reportedly heated rocks beside campfires before wrapping them in cloth and placing them beneath blankets overnight for warmth. Effective. Certainly, although one suspects the phrase carefully monitored thermal comfort solution quickly became accidental wagon fire if enthusiasm exceeded planning. The father returns carrying a tiny metal pot of embers from the fire outside. The smell reaches you first. Fresh smoke, sharp and warm. He sets the pot carefully near the wagon entrance to add a little heat before morning. Dangerous perhaps? Necessary, definitely. A well-documented truth from overland travel accounts is that many emigrants feared nighttime fires almost as much as freezing temperatures. Covered wagons carried dry wood, cloth, grease, gunpowder, and supplies packed tightly together. One overturned lantern could destroy everything within minutes. The embers glow softly now in the darkness. Red light flickers across tired faces and hanging cookware. The wagon suddenly feels less like a storage crate and more like a tiny floating island of warmth, drifting through the frozen prairie. Outside, the more travellers awaken. You hear coughing from nearby wagons. Quiet voices. Someone arguing softly with an ox that apparently sees no compelling reason to begin another miserable day before sunrise. The mother tears cornbread carefully into pieces, one for each child, one for the father, one for herself, and somehow one for you too. It tastes dry enough to absorb nearby moisture from the atmosphere, but the warmth from the embers makes it strangely comforting. Hunger changes expectations remarkably fast. A child asks whether breakfast will include bacon. The father answers with the cautious tone of a man negotiating international diplomacy. Maybe, which frontier children probably understood translated roughly into absolutely not, but let us preserve morale for another 10 minutes. Outside, The wind has eased considerably. You can hear frost cracking softly beneath footsteps moving through camp. Metal rings against metal somewhere near the wagons. A horse snorts loudly enough to startle sleeping birds from nearby brush. Then comes laughter. Brief. Tired. Real. That surprises you more than anything. Despite the cold, despite exhaustion, despite sleeping inside what amounts to a moving wooden closet, people still laugh out here. Small jokes survive remarkably well on difficult journeys. One emigrant woman recorded that her husband once spent an entire freezing night blaming a mysterious lump beneath his blankets on poor bedding arrangements, only to discover he had been sleeping on a turnip. Scholars continue discussing how much humour actually helped emigrant groups endure psychological strain during long migrations. Letters and diaries suggest joking became an important release valve against fear, grief, and monotony. Human beings will apparently invent comedy almost anywhere, even while freezing beside livestock. The embers in the metal pot begin fading slowly. The father notices immediately. Soon he will have to return outside for more fuel. Soon the wagons will begin moving again. But not yet. For now. The camp lingers in that strange hour before dawn, where darkness still rules the prairie but morning quietly waits somewhere beyond the horizon. You lean slightly toward the fading warmth. The wagon canvas no longer snaps violently in the wind. Frost glitters faintly along the seams overhead. Nearby, breathing rises softly beneath blankets, while tired travellers delay the coming day for just a few more precious minutes. And outside, beyond the dim wagon circle, the frozen prairie stretches silent and endless beneath the stars, waiting patiently for the fires to wake again. The sky outside remains dark, but morning has begun anyway. You sense it first through movement. Camp noises slowly multiply across the prairie, wagon flaps opening, harness chains rattling, boots crunching over frozen grass. Somewhere nearby, a kettle lid clatters onto the ground, followed by a deeply exhausted voice whispering something unkind toward gravity. Inside your wagon, nobody wants to leave the blankets. That is the great emotional tragedy of frontier mornings. The moment you finally create a pocket of warmth through body heat and layered quilts, dawn arrives demanding productivity. The father delays longest. He sits near the wagon opening, wrapped in blankets, like an irritated frontier burrito staring into the darkness beyond the flap. His breath curls pale in the cold air. You suspect he is mentally negotiating with the sunrise. Unfortunately, oxen do not accept philosophical excuses for breakfast delays. The mother is already reorganizing supplies. Again, there appears to be no end to frontier reorganizing. Everything shifts during travel. Flour sacks settle, cooking pans slide, bedding twists into impossible shapes overnight. One historical account mentioned a woman discovering an entire bag of coffee beans hidden beneath sleeping quilts after searching for it across 3 states. The frontier apparently doubled as the world's least efficient lost and found department. You rub your hands together slowly. Cold has settled deep into your fingers during the night. Not painful exactly, just stiff and unpleasant. The wagon interior smells sharper this morning. Frosty air mixing with damp canvas and old smoke. Then you notice the roof. Tiny crystals glitter overhead. Ice, your breath and everyone else's condensed during the night, froze against the canvas and now hangs above you like a delicate winter cave. Every movement sends little sparkles drifting downward through the dim light. A commonly accepted detail from emigrant diaries describes travellers waking to frozen wagon interiors during harsh weather. Moisture from breathing collected everywhere. Canvas roofs, blanket edges, moustaches. One unfortunate traveller reportedly awoke with his beard frozen directly against a buffalo robe. You pull yourself upright carefully. Immediately your back protests. Sleeping inside wagons rarely improved posture. Most adults could not fully stretch out. Knees bent awkwardly, shoulders pressed against crates, Hips settled onto uneven bedding over wooden floors. Modern chiropractors would probably collapse emotionally after reviewing frontier sleeping conditions. Outside, the camp grows louder now. Oxen bellow impatiently. A baby cries. Someone coughs continuously near another wagon. Deep, rough coughing that lingers too long in the cold morning air. You hear an axe striking wood again. Steadier now. The father finally sighs and reaches for his boots. This process takes time because the leather has stiffened overnight. He mutters quietly while forcing frozen boots onto reluctant feet. Frontier mornings apparently began with daily arguments against footwear. A peculiar little custom appears in several overland trail recollections. Some emigrants slept with tomorrow's clothes tucked beneath blankets beside them, so fabric would stay warmer overnight. Otherwise dresses, coats, and socks could become painfully cold by morning. Nothing starts a successful day quite like putting on trousers that feel spiritually connected to ice fishing. The wagon flap opens. Grey pre-dawn light spills inside. The prairie beyond looks silver with frost. Fires smoke weakly between scattered wagons. Thin figures move through camp wrapped in blankets and coats. Oxen stand steaming in the cold, while breath drifts slowly upward around their heads. You smell coffee. Weak frontier coffee, perhaps. Possibly coffee only in the legal sense, but still. That smell changes everything. The mother smiles faintly for the first time all night. Outside, travellers gather around the fires, holding tin cups between stiff fingers. Their faces look tired beneath frost-coated hats and scarves. Yet the camp feels alive again now. Human voices push back against the darkness. A reliable historical fact from Western migration records is that emigrant camps often woke long before sunrise in order to maximize daylight travel hours. Wagons typically moved at walking speed, and every hour mattered before weather changed or water sources became difficult to reach. You climb awkwardly from the wagon. Cold strikes immediately, not the muted cold trapped beneath blankets. Open prairie cold. Sharp enough to sting your lungs. Frost crunches beneath your boots while smoke drifts low across camp, carrying scents of coffee, bacon grease, damp wool, and burning buffalo chips. The prairie fire from yesterday has left black streaks across the nearby grasslands. Thin smoke still rises from certain patches. Ash crunches softly beneath your feet. The father crouches beside a fire ring, feeding tiny sticks into weak flames. Real firewood remains scarce here. Most of last night's fuel burned away quickly. What remains now are scraps gathered from brush and roots near the creek bank. One traveller nearby jokes that the wagon train has officially entered luxury fuel poverty. Several tired people laugh harder than the joke deserves. That happens often when everyone sleeps badly. Researchers still discuss how emigrant families balanced optimism with the relentless physical discomfort of Western migration. Many letters sent home emphasized progress and determination, while private diaries revealed fatigue, anxiety, and homesickness hidden beneath polite language. You warm your hands cautiously near the fire. Smoke clings instantly to your clothes. Nearby, one boy scrapes frost from a wagon wheel while another shakes blankets free of frozen moisture. A woman hangs damp cloth near the flames, hoping sunlight later might dry it completely. Everyone works constantly, even during these quiet early moments. A horse suddenly sneezes with explosive force directly beside the fire. Half the camp jumps. One man mutters that the horse has the manners of a cannon. Again, laughter drifts softly through the freezing air. You notice something comforting in that. Nobody here appears heroic in the grand dramatic way frontier paintings often suggest. These are simply tired people making coffee, fixing harnesses, warming hands, and trying not to freeze beside wagons full of damp blankets. And somehow that feels far more human. The eastern horizon slowly lightens now beyond the endless prairie. Pale grey first, then soft blue. The frost glitters brighter across the wagon canvas while smoke rises quietly into the waking sky. And for a few brief moments before the wheels begin turning again, The frozen camp rests together in the cold morning stillness. By afternoon, winter loosens its grip just enough to create an entirely different kind of misery. Mud everywhere! The frozen prairie softens beneath weak sunlight until the ground transforms into thick, sucking earth that clings to boots, wagon wheels, animal hooves, and dignity with equal determination. You walk beside the wagon now because the interior has become too crowded during travel hours, but each step feels like negotiating with wet cement. The wagon wheels groan through deep ruts, mud splashes against the canvas sides, oxen strain forward with slow, exhausted movements, while drivers call softly to them through drifting mist. The air smells different today. Damp grass, wet earth, animal sweat, smoke lingering in clothing from last night's fires, and underneath everything that sharp scent of thawing prairie. The camp from the freezing dawn already feels far away. Your boots grow heavier with every mile. One child loses a shoe entirely in the mud and bursts into tears while 3 adults search for it with the grim seriousness usually reserved for archaeological excavations. Eventually the shoe emerges from the earth looking deeply offended by frontier life. A surprising number of emigrant diaries mention mud more often than dramatic dangers. Rain and thaw transformed sections of western trails into endless brown swamps capable of trapping wagons for hours. Travellers sometimes laid brush, branches, or even spare wagon parts into muddy sections to create temporary crossings. You glance back at the wagon canvas overhead. Yesterday's frost has become dampness now. The fabric hangs heavy with moisture. Water drips slowly from one patched seam near the rear wheel. Inside the wagon, blankets and bedding absorb the damp air despite everyone's efforts to protect them. That is the hidden danger of thawing weather. Cold alone is difficult. Wet cold becomes personal. The father notices dark clouds gathering again toward the west. So does everybody else. Nobody says much about it, though. Frontier travellers developed an almost professional talent for pretending weather might somehow become somebody else's problem. By sunset, the wagon train finally stops beside a shallow creek lined with cottonwood trees. The campsite feels less exposed than open prairie, though the ground remains damp beneath your boots. Fires begin appearing one by one through camp while smoke drifts upward into the darkening sky. You help gather wood. Wet wood, of course. Nothing burns quite like frontier disappointment. The branches hiss and spit when placed near the flames. Smoke billows everywhere, thick enough to sting your eyes and settle into your hair. One man nearby claims the camp now smells like burning soup and wet socks. Honestly, that feels accurate. A lesser-known detail from overland trail life involves how constantly emigrants fought moisture. Wet blankets, wet clothing, wet boots, damp flour, soaked gunpowder. Entire evenings often revolved around drying supplies before temperatures dropped again overnight. Inside the wagon later, everything feels colder than yesterday despite slightly warmer weather, because now it is damp. The bedding beneath you carries a faint chill that no amount of rearranging completely fixes. You pull blankets closer anyway while listening to rain begin tapping softly overhead once more. The little girl groans immediately upon hearing it. Apparently even frontier children eventually reached emotional limits regarding weather-related plot twists. The mother checks the canvas seams carefully with her fingers. One leak near the rear has worsened during travel. She stuffs folded cloth against it while the father tightens exterior ropes outside in the rain. The wagon rocks gently as he works. Water drips steadily from the canvas edge near the opening flap. A small but memorable frontier belief held that sleeping with wet boots beneath your head prevented them from freezing overnight. Whether this technique improved footwear conditions or merely introduced extremely unpleasant pillow arrangements remains unclear. The father climbs back inside, carrying the smell of rain and cold air with him. His coat sleeves glisten with moisture. Nobody has dry feet anymore. That realization settles quietly across the wagon. Children complain less now because exhaustion has overtaken discomfort. One by one they curl beneath blankets while rain continues brushing softly overhead. You shift position carefully atop the bedding. Immediately you feel moisture underneath one elbow. Wonderful. The dampness has worked its way through part of the lower quilts despite everyone's efforts. Not soaked exactly. Worse, perhaps. Just cold enough to remain constantly noticeable. A documented reality from emigrant letters reveals how dangerous sleeping wet could become during Western migration. Prolonged exposure to damp cold weakened travellers steadily, contributing to illness, exhaustion, and frost injuries during harsher weather periods. Outside, the creek gurgles softly through darkness. Rainwater slides from the wagon canvas in slow, uneven rhythms. Fires beyond camp shrink lower beneath the drizzle. You smell wet ashes drifting through the night air. The mother unwraps one final dry blanket from a carefully protected bundle. Everyone notices. That blanket represents security now. Emergency warmth still untouched by rain. She spreads it over the children first without hesitation. The father says nothing. He simply pulls his own coat tighter and settles against the wagon wall. Specialists who study emigrant diaries still disagree about how families divided limited comforts during difficult trail conditions. Some accounts describe remarkable generosity. Others reveal tension, resentment, and arguments hidden beneath polite historical language. Hardship rarely improves human personalities consistently. The rain strengthens briefly. Water drums louder overhead. You watch tiny droplets gathering again along the inside canvas roof where warm breath meets cold fabric. One falls onto your sleeve, then another. The wagon smells overwhelmingly of wet wool now. Wet wool, damp leather, smoke, mud, and tired human beings trying desperately to sleep. Outside, oxen shift restlessly near the creek bank while rain softens the entire world into whispers. Inside the crowded wagon, blankets rustle softly as everyone searches for warmth that keeps slipping away into the damp prairie night. The rain finally fades sometime near midnight. Not completely, just enough that individual sounds begin returning to the prairie again. You lie awake beneath damp blankets, listening carefully. The creek nearby moves steadily through darkness. Wet branches drip softly overhead. Somewhere beyond the wagons, an ox shakes its massive head, bells clinking once before silence settles again. Then comes the howl, long, thin, distant enough to avoid immediate panic, but close enough that every adult inside the wagon opens their eyes. Nobody moves at first. The sound fades across the prairie and disappears into the night air. Then another answers farther away. The little girl beside you whispers immediately, "Wolf." Her brother lifts his head halfway from the blankets, with sudden excitement that clearly suggests he would enjoy absolutely the worst survival decisions imaginable. The father exhales slowly through his nose. Probably coyotes, possibly wolves. Either way, nobody is volunteering to investigate. Outside, one of the camp dogs begins barking furiously toward the darkness. Other dogs join in farther across camp until the entire wagon circle seems surrounded by sharp, nervous noise. The oxen shuffle uneasily. Leather harnesses creak. You feel tension spreading quietly through the wagon despite everyone's exhaustion. Night always enlarges uncertainty on the frontier. A noise heard in daylight becomes something far larger after midnight beside dying fires. The mother reaches across the bedding and pulls the children slightly closer without saying anything. Her fingers feel cold against the blanket edge. A documented truth from trail journals reveals that emigrants frequently formed wagon circles or partial defensive lines at night when possible. Contrary to popular myth, these arrangements usually protected livestock from wandering rather than preparing for dramatic attacks. Still, the circular camps offered emotional comfort once darkness swallowed the plains. Outside, the barking slowly weakens. One final howl drifts faintly through the wet air. Then silence again. The little boy whispers that he wants to see a wolf someday. His father replies instantly, "No, you don't." A pause. Then more honestly, "Not close anyway." The wagon settles back into stillness. You can hear the canvas shifting gently overhead as cooler air dries the fabric after rain. The smell inside remains damp but softer now. Wet wool, smoke, earthy buffalo hide, human breath trapped beneath blankets. A rather strange frontier belief claimed wolves could sense fear through wagon canvas at night. Some emigrants reportedly scattered ashes or strong-smelling herbs around campsites, hoping to confuse predators. Whether wolves were spiritually outwitted by prairie seasoning remains scientifically uncertain. You close your eyes again. Almost immediately another sound reaches camp.
Not howling this time.
Singing, very faint at first, somewhere beyond the nearby wagons. A man hums quietly beside one of the remaining fires. The tune drifts slowly through darkness, uneven but comforting. You cannot make out the words if there are any. Just the soft rise and fall of melody carried across the cold air. Nobody complains. In fact, the wagon seems calmer because of it. Experts who study overland migration often point out how important music became during frontier travel. Families carried fiddles, hymn books, harmonicas, and small flutes westward despite limited space. Songs helped maintain rhythm during long marches and offered emotional relief after difficult days. The father relaxes slightly against the wagon wall. Outside, the singing continues. Another voice joins quietly for a few moments before fading away again. You stare upward at the dark curve of the wagon roof, while moonlight filters weakly through thinning clouds. Tiny moisture stains spread across the canvas like pale watercolor shapes. One repaired patch near the center roofline still leaks occasionally, despite the evening repairs. A droplet lands softly near your shoulder. Wonderful. The frontier remains committed to consistency. The little girl finally drifts back to sleep beside her mother. Her breathing slows beneath the blankets. The boy remains awake longer, listening toward the darkness outside as though hoping wolves might suddenly arrive, riding stolen horses or conducting organized frontier business meetings. Instead, only the prairie answers, wind moving softly through wet grass, crackling embers somewhere beyond camp, the distant creek flowing endlessly through darkness. One fascinating trail account describes emigrants tying tiny bells onto livestock during nighttime storms, so wandering animals could still be located in darkness. Imagine trying to sleep while hearing mysterious bells drifting across freezing prairie fog. Very atmospheric. Slightly haunted. Your own exhaustion settles deeper now. The wagon floor still aches beneath your hips. Dampness clings stubbornly to the lower blankets. Yet the air no longer feels quite as bitterly cold as earlier in the journey. Perhaps because the rain clouds trapped a little warmth overhead. Or perhaps because your body has begun accepting frontier discomfort as temporary normality. That realization feels mildly concerning. Outside, the camp gradually quiets completely again. The singing fades. Dogs stop barking. Only occasional livestock sounds remain drifting through the night. Some historians continue questioning how strongly fear shaped emigrant experiences after dark. Certain diaries describe terrifying isolation, while others mention peaceful evenings filled with storytelling and laughter. Much likely depended on weather, illness, exhaustion, and the personalities travelling beside you. The father shifts carefully beneath the blankets. Wood creaks softly under his weight. Nearby, the mother murmurs something half asleep to one of the children before settling again into silence. You breathe slowly beneath the heavy buffalo robe. The wagon smells warmer now despite the dampness, more lived in somehow, less like cargo space and more like a fragile moving home balanced carefully against the enormous prairie surrounding it. Beyond the canvas walls, darkness stretches endlessly across wet grasslands beneath scattered stars. Somewhere out there, coyotes continue calling to one another through the night, while the wagon camp sleeps beside the creek, small fires glowing faintly against the vast silent plains. By the next evening, the children are the first to climb into the wagon, not because they are rested, because they are completely exhausted. The trail today has been long and uneven, crossing stretches of muddy prairie broken by frozen patches hard enough to jar wagon wheels violently. Every bump rattled cookware overhead and tossed sleeping supplies into fresh chaos. Somewhere during the afternoon, a sack of beans split open inside the wagon, creating what the father called a highly nutritious avalanche. Now dust settles softly across the plains while the family prepares for another freezing night. The children move automatically through familiar routines, boots off near the wagon entrance, blankets shaken out, dry clothes protected carefully near the centre bedding. The little boy attempts to hide an interesting shaped rock inside the wagon before his mother notices and quietly removes what appears to be half the frontier landscape from his pockets. Children on western trails adapted remarkably fast to wagon life. Many emigrant diaries mention young travellers learning camp tasks early, such as gathering fuel, watching livestock, carrying water, and helping prepare bedding. Childhood on the frontier involved far fewer conversations about screen time and considerably more discussions regarding whether the oxen had wandered into the river again. You climb inside after them. The wagon already feels warmer tonight from trapped body heat and lingering sunlight stored in the wood. Not warm by modern standards, of course. More like slightly less hostile. The little girl curls immediately beneath the buffalo robe. Her cheeks look flushed from wind and cold. Strands of hair escape her bonnet in tangled curls while she fights sleep with the determination of someone who absolutely lost that battle hours ago. The mother checks everyone's hands carefully. Cold fingers, cold noses, cold feet. Parents on the frontier spent enormous energy protecting children from exposure. Smaller bodies lost heat faster during winter travel, especially after river crossings or storms. Surviving letters from emigrant mothers reveal constant concern about fevers, frostbite, coughs, and damp clothing. The father enters last carrying an armful of wood. A very small armful. Fuel remains scarce again. He stacks the wood carefully near the wagon wall, before climbing inside with visible reluctance, as though he fully understands that another cramped night awaits him beneath cookware and questionable bedding engineering. Outside, campfires flicker low against the darkening prairie. Smoke drifts through the wagon opening carrying scents of grease, sagebrush, and wet earth. Somewhere nearby, a fiddle plays briefly before stopping mid-tune, perhaps because the musician lost feeling in their fingers, or possibly patience with frontier acoustics. The children whisper together beneath the blankets. They talk about wolves again, naturally. Children throughout history have apparently enjoyed terrifying themselves immediately before bedtime, regardless of era or survival circumstances. A curious story appears in one trail journal describing a little girl who became convinced buffalo could smell fear through wagon canvas at night. Her solution involved sleeping while wearing her father's hat because she believed it made her scent more intimidating. Strangely adorable. Deeply flawed wilderness strategy. The wagon creaks softly as everyone settles into place. Tonight, the little boy sleeps near your feet while his sister lies between her parents beneath the thickest blankets. Space disappears almost instantly once everyone stretches out. Your elbow rests against a crate corner again. Apparently, this crate has become a recurring supporting character in your suffering. The mother pulls another quilt across the children and tucks the edges carefully around them to block drafts. She repeats the motion several times throughout the evening whenever cold air slips beneath the blankets. One long-accepted historical observation about emigrant life is that frontier mothers often carried extraordinary responsibility during Western migration. Cooking, laundry, childcare, nursing illness, repairing clothing, organizing supplies, and maintaining routines continued despite constant travel and harsh conditions. Outside, wind brushes softly across the prairie grass. The weather has turned colder again after sunset. Frost already forms along the wagon tongue. You can hear ice beginning to crust near the creek bank beyond camp. The father rubs his hands together near his mouth before blowing warm air onto stiff fingers. Then he reaches overhead and removes a small cloth bag hanging from the wagon bow. Peppermint candies, or something attempting to become peppermint candies despite months of travel. The children brighten instantly. Each receives one tiny piece. That single moment changes the entire wagon atmosphere. Suddenly everyone smiles. The little girl giggles sleepily while trying to keep the candy from sticking to her blanket. Researchers examining emigrant diaries often note how important tiny luxuries became during difficult journeys. Candy, coffee, preserved fruit, songs, stories, even bits of ribbon or family photographs offered emotional comfort far beyond their practical value. You suck slowly on your own peppermint piece. Mostly sugar now. Still wonderful. Outside, another wagon nearby erupts briefly into laughter after somebody apparently sits directly onto a tin plate hidden beneath blankets. Frontier comedy remains beautifully simple. The little boy asks his father whether children ever drove wagons alone. The father answers carefully. Sometimes older boys did. This inspires approximately 6 dangerous new ideas immediately. The mother notices too. No, she says it before the boy even speaks. Remarkable efficiency. The wagon grows quieter as sleep approaches again. One child mumbles half-formed thoughts before drifting off entirely. Another curls closer beneath the quilts. Their breathing softens slowly in the dim lantern glow. You notice how carefully the parents position themselves around the children. Bodies blocking drafts, blankets shared automatically, boots placed within easy reach for morning. Every movement shaped by protection. Some scholars continue debating how frontier hardships affected emotional bonds within emigrant families. Certain accounts suggest strain and exhaustion created tension. Others reveal deep tenderness strengthened through shared survival. Likely both existed together far more often than romantic frontier stories admit. The lantern finally goes dark. Moonlight filters faintly through the wagon canvas while frost spreads quietly across the prairie outside. Inside the crowded wagon, children sleep tucked beneath buffalo robes and patched quilts while their parents remain half awake beside them, listening to the endless western night breathing softly beyond the thin canvas walls. The coughing begins before midnight. At first it sounds harmless, one rough breath from a nearby wagon, then another farther through camp. Soon the cold prairie air carries scattered coughs drifting between the fires like signals passed quietly through darkness. Inside your wagon, everyone notices. Nobody says anything immediately. The father stares toward the canvas wall listening while the mother adjusts blankets around the sleeping children with slightly sharper movements than before. Illness travelled easily on western trails. Too easily. Families slept close together, shared water sources, handled the same supplies, breathed the same smoky air night after night. Dust during dry months and damp cold during storms weakened travellers steadily. Once sickness entered a wagon company, it often spread quickly through exhausted bodies already running low on strength. Outside, another coughing fit echoes through camp. Longer this time. You hear a woman murmuring softly afterward, perhaps offering water or reassurance. The prairie falls quiet again, except for crackling fires and shifting livestock. The wagon tonight feels unusually warm. Not comforting warm, heavy warm, the kind created by too many breathing bodies inside a sealed space while cold air presses against the canvas outside. Moisture gathers quickly overhead. You can smell wool blankets drying slowly from body heat and yesterday's damp weather. The little boy beside you rolls over in his sleep. His forehead brushes your arm for a moment. Too warm. The mother notices instantly. She presses her hand gently against his head, then his neck, then his cheeks. Parents on the frontier became amateur doctors out of necessity. Wagon trains rarely included trained physicians, and even when they did, medicine remained painfully limited by modern standards. Families relied on home remedies, herbal treatments, rest, luck, and endless hope packed beside the flour sacks. The boy sighs but keeps sleeping. The mother does not. She reaches for a small tin box tucked carefully near the bedding. Inside rests a collection of remedies wrapped in cloth and paper. Dried herbs, salves, a little bottle of camphor, precious supplies carried hundreds of miles across rough trails. One fascinating trail account describes emigrants carrying onions in pockets or hanging them near sick beds because many people believed onions absorbed disease from the air. The onions, unfortunately, received no voting rights in this medical arrangement. Outside, wind brushes softly across the prairie. The weather has calmed tonight, leaving the camp wrapped in cold stillness beneath the stars. Smoke rises almost straight upward from the fires. Somewhere nearby, an ox tears slowly at frozen grass with heavy, patient movements. The father finally speaks in a low voice. He worked hard today. The mother nods once. That means they are hoping exhaustion explains the fever. You hope so too. A deeply established historical reality from immigrant diaries is that disease killed far more travellers than dramatic accidents or attacks. Cholera outbreaks especially terrified wagon companies during certain years, though ordinary fevers, infections, and respiratory illnesses also claimed many lives along western trails. The little girl wakes briefly and asks for water. Her mother helps her drink from a tin cup carefully protected beneath the blankets, so the water will not freeze overnight. Even simple tasks move slowly inside the crowded wagon. Every elbow risks knocking supplies loose. Every shift sends cold air sneaking beneath the quilts. You notice how quiet the parents have become now. Not panicked, just listening, watching. The father reaches over and places another blanket lightly across the boy despite the warmth in his face. Sweat during freezing nights could become dangerous once temperatures dropped further before dawn. Beyond the wagon, a horse stomps sharply against the frozen ground. Then comes another fit of coughing from somewhere through camp, this time followed by a baby crying. The sounds drift together strangely beneath the stars. A curious little remedy appears in several frontier journals involving heated vinegar placed near sleeping areas, because people believed strong vapours protected against sickness. Imagine already sleeping inside a damp, smoky wagon, and then adding boiling vinegar fumes to the atmosphere. Truly ambitious respiratory planning. The lantern burns low near the wagon entrance. Its faint light turns the canvas walls amber while shadows sway gently overhead. You can see moisture glittering along the wagon bows again, where warm air condenses against the freezing roof. The little boy mutters something in his sleep. His mother brushes hair from his forehead carefully. The father stares downward at his hands. Trail historians continue discussing how emigrant families emotionally manage sickness during long journeys. Letters sent home often softened the reality of illness, while private diaries reveal deep fear beneath practical descriptions. Many travellers understood how isolated they truly were once serious disease appeared far from settlements. You lie still beneath the buffalo robe listening to camp sounds outside, someone quietly chopping wood, harness chains rattling softly, low voices near another fire. Then silence again. The wagon feels smaller tonight, not physically, emotionally. The canvas walls suddenly seem very thin between this little family and the enormous wilderness surrounding them. Cold prairie beyond, dark sky overhead, miles upon miles separating the wagon train from doctors, towns, or certainty. The mother finally leans back against the wagon wall, not sleeping, just resting her eyes for a moment while one hand remains lightly against the boy's shoulder beneath the blankets. The father reaches over quietly and covers her hand with his own. No words, none needed, outside. Frost spreads slowly across the silent prairie while smoke drifts upward into the freezing night. Inside the wagon, lantern light flickers softly across tired faces and bundled quilts as the little family waits together beneath the canvas roof, listening carefully to every breath until morning finally comes. The boy's fever eases slightly by morning. Not gone, but lower enough that everyone breathes easier without fully admitting it aloud. The wagon train moves slowly today beneath pale winter sunlight. Frost still coats the prairie grass in shaded places, though the afternoon sun softens the edges of frozen puddles beside the trail. Oxen plod forward patiently through the cold while wagon wheels creak across uneven ground. You walk beside the wagon again, mostly because there is no room inside once supplies shift during travel. Also because the father claims walking keeps blood warm, though judging by his expression, his blood remains deeply unconvinced. The little boy stays wrapped in blankets inside the wagon through much of the day. His mother checks him constantly during stops. Water, forehead, more blankets, less blankets. Frontier medicine often resembled a desperate negotiation between temperature and optimism. By late afternoon, the wagon train reaches a small trading camp near the edge of open prairie. Smoke rises from several low structures built near a creek crossing. Horses stand tied beside rough wooden fences while traders move slowly through the cold, carrying hides and supplies. The smell reaches you first. Wood smoke, animal fur, leather, and something rich cooking somewhere nearby that instantly reminds every traveller they have spent several weeks surviving mostly on bacon, beans, and stubbornness. The father speaks quietly with another emigrant before heading toward the traders. When he returns later, he carries 2 folded buffalo robes across his arms. Heavy, dark, still smelling faintly of smoke and open plains. The children stare at them with something close to religious admiration. Buffalo robes ranked among the most prized cold weather items on western trails. Thick winter hides trapped warmth remarkably well, and offered far better protection than to ordinary blankets during freezing nights. Traders across the plains sold enormous numbers of them to emigrants heading westward. You help spread the robes inside the wagon as evening settles over camp. The difference feels immediate. The fur is dense and slightly oily beneath your fingers. Warmth gathers beneath it quickly once everyone climbs inside. For the first time in many nights, the wagon interior almost approaches genuine comfort. Almost. The little girl buries her face happily into one robe before immediately sneezing, because frontier luxury still contains approximately 40% buffalo. Outside, campfires brighten against the darkening sky. The trading camp feels busier than the ordinary wagon stops. Voices drift through the cold evening air. Horses snort near the creek. Somewhere nearby, a hammer strikes metal rhythmically, while traders repair tack before nightfall. A fascinating historical pattern emerges repeatedly in emigrant accounts. Many overland travellers borrowed survival techniques directly from indigenous communities they encountered along the trails. Clothing layers, moccasins, buffalo robe use, snow travel methods, and even camp arrangements often reflected knowledge already perfected across generations on the plains. The father sits near the wagon opening cleaning mud from his boots, while the mother reorganizes bedding around the new robes. Everything smells strongly now of fur, smoke, damp canvas and wood ash, oddly comforting. The little boy finally sits upright again beneath the blankets, pale still, tired, but smiling weakly after receiving a tin cup of broth from his mother. Outside, laughter rises from another fire where several traders and emigrants exchange stories in mixed accents beneath drifting sparks. One man claims he once saw a buffalo so large it frightened an entire cavalry patrol simply by existing nearby. Nobody fully believes him. Nobody fully disbelieves him either. Frontier storytelling operated under different scientific standards after dark. One unusual prairie custom described in trading post journals involved travellers sleeping wrapped entirely inside buffalo robes during severe weather, with only tiny breathing openings left uncovered. Effective, perhaps, though one imagines waking inside what amounts to a heavily furred sleeping burrito could become emotionally disorienting. The temperature drops sharply after sunset. You hear ice forming along the creek edges outside camp. Horses stamp restlessly near the corrals while smoke settles low through the still night air. Inside the wagon, however, the new robes transform everything. Not perfectly. Your hips still ache against the wooden floor beneath the bedding. Space remains painfully limited. The wagon canvas still leaks cold air through seams overhead, but warmth lingers longer now. Human heat stays trapped beneath the thick fur instead of disappearing instantly into the freezing darkness. The little girl falls asleep first tonight, curled directly beneath one robe with visible satisfaction. Her brother soon follows. No coughing now, only soft, steady breathing beneath the blankets. The mother finally relaxes slightly against the wagon wall after hours of watching him. A broad scholarly consensus suggests many emigrant families survived difficult weather largely through adaptability rather than original preparation. Travellers constantly traded, borrowed, improvised, and learned new techniques across the frontier depending on local conditions. Outside, fiddles begin playing somewhere near the trading fires. The music drifts softly through camp, slow at first, then livelier. You can hear boots crunching over frost and occasional bursts of laughter between songs. Even the oxen seem calmer tonight beneath the still sky. The father listens quietly for a while before speaking. Sounds warmer, that is. You know exactly what he means. Music changes cold somehow. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally. The camp no longer feels isolated against endless prairie darkness. It feels human again. The lantern inside the wagon burns low while buffalo robes cover nearly every inch of bedding. Their heavy warmth presses gently around you, outside. The freezing plains stretch silent beyond the trading fires, but inside the crowded wagon, tired travellers settle together beneath thick fur and flickering light, while fiddle music drifts softly through the winter night. The river looks manageable from a distance. That is how the frontier tricks people. From the bluff above, the water appears calm enough. Grey surface, slow current, thin ice clinging to shaded edges near the banks. You stand beside the wagon at dawn watching mist drift across the crossing, while oxen snort clouds into the freezing air. Then the first wagon enters the water. Immediately the river changes personality. Wheels sink deeper than expected. Ice cracks sharply near the banks. Water surges hard against the wagon bed while emigrants shout to the oxen over grinding current noise. The entire crossing suddenly resembles a very determined attempt to move furniture through a glacier. Your wagon waits in line behind several others. Nobody speaks much. The father checks harness straps repeatedly, while the mother wraps extra blankets around the children inside the wagon. Wet weather during freezing temperatures remains one of the great nightmares of overland travel. Dry cold hurts, wet cold lingers. The little boy asks whether the river contains fish. His sister asks whether the river contains corpses. Frontier children clearly developed fascinating conversational priorities. A firmly established historical fact is that river crossings caused enormous difficulty for emigrant wagon trains. Depending on season and route, travellers sometimes spent days searching for safe fords or reinforcing wagon beds against leaks before attempting crossings. The first wagon ahead finally reaches the opposite bank. Barely. Water pours from its wheels while soaked emigrants stumble ashore looking emotionally betrayed by geography itself. Now your turn arrives. The father climbs beside the oxen team. The mother pulls the children close inside the wagon beneath layered buffalo robes. You climb in too while the wheels lurch forward over frozen mud toward the riverbank. Cold air rushes through the wagon opening. Then comes the first splash. Icy water slams against the wheels hard enough to shake the entire wagon body. The oxen strain forward immediately, muscles shifting beneath wet hides while the current pushes sideways against them. The wagon tilts slightly. Everyone inside grabs something. Water sprays upward through gaps near the floorboards. Wonderful. The little girl squeals as freezing droplets strike her boots. Outside, men shout instructions through the mist while harness chains rattle sharply against the noise of moving water. The river smells metallic and painfully cold. The wagon moves deeper. Water now reaches nearly halfway up the wheels. You hear ice scraping along the wagon side beneath the current. The mother tightens blankets around the children while glancing repeatedly toward the floorboards. One leak near the rear begins dripping steadily into the bedding. A strange but authentic trail practice involved greasing wagon axles and wheel hubs heavily before major crossings because freezing water could damage wooden parts rapidly afterward. Frontier maintenance apparently required equal amounts engineering and panic. The oxen slow. For one awful moment the wagon barely moves at all. Current pushes harder against the wheels. The father shouts sharply. Another man farther downstream splashes through waist-deep water, helping guide the lead oxen toward shallower ground. The little boy stares wide-eyed toward the wagon opening. Nobody breathes normally. Then suddenly the wheels lurch upward again. The opposite bank. Mud explodes beneath the wagon as the oxen drag everything free from the river with exhausted determination. Water pours from the undercarriage while the entire wagon groans like an old ship crawling onto shore after battle. Inside, everyone remains silent for several seconds. Then the mother exhales. So does everybody else. Outside, the father pats one ox heavily along its wet shoulder while steam rises from the animals into the freezing air. The wagon train immediately begins assessing damage. Blankets damp. One crate soaked along the bottom edge. Several supplies shifted during the crossing. And worst of all, your boots now contain approximately half the river. The frontier remains dedicated to immersive experiences. A number of emigrant diaries reveal how quickly wet clothing became dangerous after crossings. Travellers often stopped immediately afterward to build fires, dry blankets, and warm children before temperatures dropped further. The camp settles early that evening beside a stand of cottonwoods. Smoke fills the air almost instantly as every family in the wagon train rushes to dry clothing and bedding. Wet socks hang near fires beside steaming boots. Blankets spread across wagon tongues. One man carefully empties water from a rifle barrel while muttering words not suitable for church attendance. Inside your wagon later. Dampness still lingers everywhere, despite hours beside the flames. The buffalo robes help enormously. Without them the cold would already feel unbearable. The little girl falls asleep wrapped so completely in fur that only the tip of her nose remains visible. Her brother sits nearby, rubbing his feet dry with a scrap of cloth while proudly describing how he survived the river crossing. Despite spending most of it bundled like emotional luggage, the mother checks everyone's clothing carefully before allowing sleep. Dry socks, dry sleeves, dry blankets wherever possible. Water during winter frightened emigrant families for good reason. Specialists continue debating how much river crossings contributed to illness and mortality on western trails compared with other hardships. Many first-hand accounts describe crossings as emotionally exhausting, even when nobody drowned or lost supplies. Outside, fires crackle steadily through the cold night. The air smells wonderfully of smoke and drying wool. Wind moves softly through bare cottonwood branches overhead, while the river continues flowing darkly nearby beneath drifting mist. The father hangs one final damp coat near the wagon entrance before climbing beneath the blankets. Everyone settles slowly into place. Tonight the wagon feels warmer than expected, perhaps because surviving the crossing changed something. Cold no longer feels abstract after icy river water splashes through the floorboards beside your feet. You pull the buffalo robe tighter around your shoulders while embers glow softly outside the canvas walls. Nearby, the river murmurs endlessly through the darkness as tired travellers drift towards sleep beside drying fires, grateful simply to be warm enough to complain about tomorrow. The trouble with covered wagons is that they never stop breaking. Not dramatically most of the time, just constantly. A loose wheel rim here, torn canvas there, cracked bow supports, bent hardware, split floorboards. The entire journey west often feels less like transportation and more like escorting a very fragile wooden creature across several thousand miles while begging it not to collapse emotionally. Tonight the problem begins with the wind. You hear the canvas snapping harder than usual before sunset even fully disappears. Sharp flapping sounds crack across camp, while travellers rush to secure ropes and coverings before temperatures drop further. The father notices the damage first, One of the curved wooden bows supporting the wagon canvas has split near its base. Not completely, yet, but enough that the canvas sags visibly on one side whenever the wind pushes against it. Inside the wagon, everyone stares upward at the leaning roofline with growing concern. A functioning wagon means shelter. Shelter means survival. The father exhales slowly through his nose in the universal frontier language of, "This absolutely did not improve my evening." Camp settles quickly around you while repairs begin. Lantern light flickers across the wagon interior as supplies get shifted aside to create room for work. The children help carry bedding outside beneath another wagon, temporarily, while the mother carefully folds blankets away from damp ground. Cold air pours inside once the canvas flap remains open. The prairie beyond looks dark and enormous beneath gathering clouds. Fires glow weakly between the wagons while smoke drifts sideways in the strengthening wind. You hold the lantern while the father examines the cracked bow. The wood creaks softly whenever gusts hit the canvas overhead. Several emigrant journals mention nightly wagon repairs becoming routine during difficult stretches of trail. Travellers patched wheels, tightened iron fittings, replaced spokes, resewed canvas, and reinforced wagon bows, constantly using whatever materials remained available. The father removes the damaged section carefully. One wrong movement and the entire canvas roof threatens to slump downward like a deeply discouraged tent. The little boy watches with complete fascination. Naturally, nothing attracts children faster than dangerous tools near unstable structures. The mother notices too and immediately redirects him toward holding spare nails instead. A curious frontier improvisation involved using rawhide strips soaked in water as temporary repair bindings. Once dry, the rawhide tightened remarkably hard around cracked wood or wagon parts. Practical, effective, and slightly alarming if you imagine your transportation being held together by aggressively determined leather noodles. Outside, another traveller approaches carrying tools. No ceremony, no formal discussion, just immediate assistance. That happened frequently in wagon camps. Repairs rarely stayed private for long because everyone understood their own wagon might fail tomorrow. Cooperation travelled quickly across the frontier when freezing nights depended on functional shelter. The two men work together beneath lantern light while wind rattles the loose canvas overhead. Hammer taps echo softly through the cold air. Wood shavings gather near the wagon wheel. Your fingers ache holding the lantern steady in the freezing wind, but nobody complains much anymore. Fatigue has worn the edges off discomfort. The mother heats coffee beside the nearby fire while watching the sky carefully. Snow threatens. You can smell it coming. That dry metallic scent drifting through the cold air before storms arrive across open plains. A reliable historical observation from Western migration accounts is that emigrants often timed repairs urgently before weather systems arrived. Even minor wagon damage could become catastrophic once snow, freezing rain, or strong winds entered the equation. The cracked bow finally gets reinforced using a splintered support cut from spare wood. Not elegant, not permanent, but stable enough for travel. Probably. The frontier frequently operated on the comforting phrase, probably. The father tests the repaired section cautiously. The bow holds. Everyone relaxes slightly. Then immediately the canvas tears. Of course it does. A gust catches the loosened edge before anyone fully secures it, ripping a jagged opening near the roof seam. Cold air blasts through while the canvas snaps violently overhead like a sail during a storm. The little girl gasps. The father closes his eyes briefly. Not in prayer exactly. More in exhausted spiritual negotiation. The mother retrieves sewing supplies instantly. Needles. Heavy thread. Spare cloth patches. You suddenly realize frontier women repaired nearly everything made from fabric because fabric represented survival itself. Blankets, clothing, wagon covers, sacks, coats, quilts. Once cloth failed during winter travel, danger entered quickly behind it. The repair begins beside the fire. Lantern light glows warmly across the canvas while hands work steadily through the cold evening. thick thread pulls through heavy fabric with small scraping sounds. Steam rises from coffee cups nearby. Wind brushes across the prairie grass beyond camp. One lesser-known emigrant habit involved rubbing candle wax along stitched wagon seams to improve water resistance after repairs. Practical sewing and accidental pastry preparation apparently occupied neighbouring categories on the frontier. The little boy falls asleep sitting upright beside the wagon wheel halfway through the repairs. Nobody wakes him immediately. He simply remains there wrapped in blankets looking like an abandoned winter turnip. The storm clouds thicken overhead. Snow begins lightly at last. Tiny flakes drift through lantern light while the final stitches close the torn seam. Experts still examine how emigrant groups managed ongoing equipment failures during long migrations. Surviving records suggest practical skills often mattered more than physical strength alone. Sewing, woodworking, leather repair, and improvisation became daily survival tools across the trails. At last the canvas gets secured again. The patched roofline looks uneven now beneath the moonlight. Visible stitches, reinforced supports, mismatched cloth, yet strangely beautiful too. Every repair tells part of the journey. Inside the wagon later, bedding returns slowly into place while snow taps softly overhead. The patched canvas creaks gently in the wind but holds firm against the weather. The father settles heavily beneath the buffalo robe. The mother blows out the lantern. Darkness folds round the wagon once more. Outside, snow drift quietly across the prairie while repaired wheels and patched canvas rest beneath the freezing sky. Inside the crowded little wagon, tired travellers sleep beneath roofs held together by thread. Rawhide, stubbornness, and the shared belief that tomorrow's trail can still be crossed. Morning arrives through smell before light. Coffee first, then bacon grease crackling softly over fire, then wood smoke drifting through freezing air while frost still silvers the prairie grass outside the wagon. You wake slowly beneath the patched canvas roof, listening to camp stir around you. Snow from the night before lies thinly across the ground, just enough to brighten the early dawn with pale, reflected light. The wagon interior feels warmer than expected thanks to the repaired canvas and heavy buffalo robes. For once, nobody inside the wagon wakes coughing. That alone feels like luxury. The father stretches carefully beside the entrance flap, producing enough cracking sounds to suggest frontier travel may have partially turned him into firewood overnight. Nearby, the little boy remains tangled so deeply in blankets that extraction might require official engineering equipment. Outside, campfires bloom one by one across the snowy prairie. Smoke rises straight upward into still morning air. The mother opens the wagon flap briefly and cold rushes inside, carrying the glorious scent of breakfast from neighbouring camps. Immediately, every child in the wagon becomes dramatically more awake. Remarkable. Nothing motivates frontier children faster than bacon. A firmly supported historical reality is that pork products formed a major part of many emigrant diets during Western migration. Salt pork, bacon, and cured meats travelled reasonably well compared with fresh foods, though by later months travellers often dreamed passionately about vegetables and fruit like people hallucinating forbidden treasure. You climb stiffly from the wagon into the frozen dawn. Snow crunches beneath your boots. Nearby, fires glow orange against the pale morning while emigrants crouch beside kettles and frying pans wrapped in coats and blankets. Horses stand steaming near the wagon lines. Someone hums quietly while chopping wood. The world smells wonderfully alive this morning. Smoke, coffee, bacon grease, cold air. Even the oxen seem calmer beneath the clear sky. The father crouches beside the fire, turning strips of bacon in a black iron skillet. The grease snaps and hisses softly, while coffee simmers nearby in a dented pot that has likely witnessed more emotional suffering than several philosophers combined. The little girl appears beside you wrapped entirely in blankets except for her nose. She stares directly at the bacon with the focused intensity of a frontier predator. A delightfully odd account from one emigrant diary describes a traveller who carried an entire jar of pickles westward for months because he claimed pickles prevented homesickness. Sadly, the diary does not reveal whether the pickles agreed to this responsibility. The mother pours coffee carefully into tin cups. Weak coffee, perhaps, but hot. You wrap both hands around the cup immediately. Warmth seeps slowly into your fingers while frost melts from the wagon wheels nearby. Smoke drifts low through camp because the morning air remains perfectly still. The little boy finally emerges from the wagon with hair pointing in several alarming directions. His fever seems gone now. Everyone notices but pretends not to overreact from relief. Instead, the father simply hands him an extra piece of bacon. Frontier emotional expression occasionally arrived disguised as breakfast. A respected historical understanding among scholars of westward migration is that shared meals help preserve routines and morale during difficult journeys. Even simple breakfast created moments of stability amid constant travel and uncertainty. The camp slowly brightens around you. Sunlight touches the prairie at last, turning snow patches gold between the wagons. Travellers move steadily through morning tasks, feeding animals, packing bedding, tightening harnesses, shaking frost from blankets. One woman nearby attempts to brush snow from her skirt only to discover half the prairie mud from yesterday still attached underneath. The frontier always remembers. The father checks the repaired wagon bow carefully before breakfast ends. Still holding. Barely perhaps, but holding. You hear another emigrant nearby discussing axle grease, while somebody else argues about the fastest route toward the next river crossing. Conversations around campfires often drift between practical planning and complete nonsense without warning. A boy from another wagon proudly claims he saw a ghost riding across the prairie during last night's snowstorm. His mother replies that it was probably just Mr. Wheeler looking for his missing mule again. Disappointingly reasonable explanation. One overlooked detail from many trail recollections involves how strongly food smells shaped emotional memory. Travellers often remembered coffee, frying bacon, fresh bread, or stew more vividly than landscapes themselves. Comfort on the frontier frequently arrived through the nose first. The mother hands you a piece of cornbread warmed beside the skillet fire. Not fresh, not soft, but warm enough to feel miraculous. You eat slowly while watching sunlight spread farther across the frozen plains. Wagon canvas glows pale cream beneath the morning light. Smoke curls lazily upward from dozens of little fires. The camp almost looks peaceful enough to belong in paintings. Then somebody steps directly into frozen horse manure and begins muttering with deep spiritual disappointment. Balance restored. The little girl sits beside the fire warming her boots while her brother pokes cautiously at melting snow with a stick. The father finally smiles slightly for the first time in several days. Coffee helps. Warm food helps more. Some researchers continue debating whether emigrant hardships later became softened in memory through nostalgia and survival pride. Many later accounts emphasize endurance and adventure while minimizing endless cold, dampness, hunger, and exhaustion. Human beings often reshape difficult memories into stories they can comfortably carry forward. Breakfast slowly disappears. Fires burn lower. The wagon train prepares to move again. But for a few precious moments, nobody rushes. You sit wrapped in cold morning sunlight beside crackling fires while bacon smoke drifts gently across the snow-dusted prairie. Nearby, patched wagons wait quietly beneath the pale sky, and inside one crowded little wagon, blankets still hold traces of warmth from the long, freezing night now finally left behind. The ghost stories begin because the wind refuses to stop. By evening, the wagon train has crossed into flatter country again, where the prairie stretches open in every direction beneath a hard grey sky. Nothing blocks the wind here. It rolls endlessly across the grasslands carrying dust, frost, and strange sounds after sunset. The wagons circle loosely near a shallow rise. Fires struggle tonight. Flames bend sideways beneath the gusts while smoke lashes through camp low enough to sting your eyes. Everyone smells permanently of wood smoke now. Clothing, blankets, hair. Even the buffalo robes carry traces of campfires from weeks earlier. Inside the wagon, the patched canvas roof snaps sharply overhead whenever stronger gusts hit. The little girl hates this weather immediately. She insists the wind sounds like people whispering outside. Her brother, being a devoted younger sibling in the frontier tradition of making situations dramatically worse, agrees enthusiastically. Soon both children stare suspiciously at the darkness beyond the wagon flap. The father tries ignoring this development. The mother fails to suppress a smile. A richly documented feature of frontier life involves storytelling after dark. Wagon camps frequently exchange tales beside evening fires, ranging from practical warnings to exaggerated disasters, religious visions, local legends, and deeply questionable personal memories improved by exhaustion and boredom. Outside, someone begins telling a story loud enough for nearby fires to hear. You catch fragments drifting through the wind. A trader lost during a blizzard. Footprints appearing around camp with no owner. A lantern seen moving across empty prairie after midnight. The little girl immediately pulls blankets closer around herself. The little boy looks delighted. Of course he does. Children throughout history have approached ghost stories with the same energy modern adults reserve for true crime documentaries and poorly considered internet rabbit holes. The father finally sighs and gives up pretending not to listen. He adds another piece of wood to the fire while the flames crackle against the cold evening air. One peculiar frontier superstition claimed whistling at night attracted wandering spirits across the plains. Another warned travellers never to answer mysterious voices heard outside camp after dark. Considering the number of exhausted, sleep-deprived emigrants wandering around prairie camps at midnight, this may actually have been excellent practical advice. The mother continues sewing beside the lantern light while the stories drift through camp. Needle through cloth, wind against canvas, low voices beyond the firelight. The wagon feels strangely cozy despite the weather outside. Not comfortable exactly, still crowded, still cold near the floorboards, still carrying the scent of damp wool and overworked humanity. But familiar now. The patched seams overhead, the hanging cookware, the careful arrangement of blankets and supplies. Your body understands the space automatically after so many nights inside it. The father eventually contributes his own story. Not ghosts. Worse perhaps. He describes a wagon company farther east, where one traveller supposedly sleepwalked directly out into the prairie during winter weather, and woke half frozen beside the oxen herd at dawn. The little girl gasps softly. The little boy asks whether the sleepwalker survived. Mostly, the father answers, a slightly alarming choice of wording. One surviving emigrant account describes travellers tying bells near wagon openings because they feared children wandering away during nighttime storms. Frontier parenting occasionally resembled operating a highly emotional livestock management system. Outside, the wind grows stronger again. Canvas walls ripple inward briefly before settling back. The lantern flame flickers. You hear laughter from another fire, followed by somebody singing badly enough to concern music itself. A well-supported historical conclusion notes that superstition remained common across many frontier communities, regardless of education or background. Isolation, harsh weather, illness, and unfamiliar landscapes encouraged folklore to travel quickly between wagon trains and settlements. The little boy asks whether wolves fear ghosts. Nobody answers immediately because honestly the question contains surprising strategic depth. The mother finally replies that wolves probably have enough problems already. Reasonable. The wagon creaks softly as everyone settles deeper beneath blankets. Outside, frost thickens across the prairie while the fires burn lower around camp. The father removes his boots and lines them carefully near the wagon wall, then repositions them, then checks them again. After weeks on the trail, emigrants became deeply suspicious of anything involving frozen footwear by morning. A curious little tale appears in one trail diary about a traveller who claimed prairie spirits untied wagon knots during the night whenever people complained too much around campfires. Strangely, this may have been less supernatural punishment and more ordinary frontier rope failure mixed with emotional storytelling. The little girl grows sleepy at last. Her fear slowly fades beneath exhaustion and warm buffalo robes. Soon only her eyes remain visible above the blankets while the lantern light glows softly across the wagon interior. Outside, another gust sweeps across the plains carrying sparks upward into darkness. The wind never fully stops here. It moves around the wagons constantly, brushing the canvas walls, rattling harness chains, whispering through frozen grass beyond the fires. Sometimes it almost sounds like voices. You understand now why frontier stories clung so tightly to lonely places. Open land does strange things to imagination after dark. Scholars continue discussing how isolation shaped folklore across Western migration routes. Many legends likely blended older European traditions with new fears born from endless distance, unfamiliar weather, and nights spent listening to enormous empty landscapes beyond thin canvas walls. The lantern finally dims lower. One by one, the fires outside shrink into glowing embers beneath the wind. Inside the wagon, blankets rustle softly while tired travellers drift towards sleep surrounded by patched canvas, ghost stories, and the endless whispering prairie stretching unseen beyond the darkness. The snow begins before dawn and never really stops. At first it falls lightly across the prairie, soft flakes drifting through the dark while the wagon train still sleeps. You wake to silence so complete it feels unnatural. No wind, no creaking grass. Even the oxen sound quieter beneath the thickening snow. Then you notice the cold. Real cold. The kind that presses through blankets despite buffalo robes and body heat. The kind that sharpens every breath inside your chest. The wagon interior glows faintly blue from snowlight filtering through the canvas overhead. Frost crystals spread along the seams near the wagon bows. One cooking pan hanging above you has frozen directly against the metal hook. The father opens the wagon flap slightly. Snow sweeps inside immediately. Outside the prairie has vanished. Not covered. Erased. Everything beyond a short distance dissolves into white drifting emptiness. Wagons nearby appear only as vague, pale shapes through the storm. Fires from the night before have disappeared beneath snow and ash. The father closes the flap again without speaking. Nobody asks questions because everyone already understands the situation. Travel today will be miserable. A broad historical consensus confirms that sudden snowstorms on western trails could halt wagon trains entirely or force painfully slow progress through dangerous conditions. Visibility vanished quickly across open plains while freezing temperatures threatened both people and livestock. The little girl whispers that the world looks gone. Honestly, she's not wrong. Inside the wagon, everyone pulls blankets tighter while snow rattles softly against the patched canvas roof. The repaired seam from earlier groans under the growing weight overhead. You hear men shouting faintly outside, then harness chains. Then the heavy, frustrated sounds of oxen being forced to wake into weather that should frankly qualify as a personal insult. The mother begins preparing everyone for the day before sunrise fully arrives. Extra socks, additional shawls, dry cloth wrapped around hands. The little boy complains about wearing too many layers until he attempts stepping outside briefly, and returns looking spiritually humbled by the temperature. One unusual frontier trick described in several emigrant accounts involved wrapping newspaper inside coats or boots for extra insulation during severe cold. Practical, perhaps, though sleeping beside damp boots stuffed with yesterday's headlines must have created very confusing dreams. The wagon starts moving slowly after dawn, very slowly. You walk beside it at first, boots sinking into fresh snow while icy wind drives crystals against your face. The prairie around the wagon train has become almost featureless beneath the storm. White ground, white sky, white drifting horizon swallowing everything beyond immediate view. The oxen lower their heads against the wind. Their breath steams heavily in the freezing air. Canvas snaps sharply overhead whenever stronger gusts hit the wagon sides. Snow gathers along every rope and wooden edge. Your eyelashes begin freezing together at the corners. This is no longer uncomfortable weather. This is survival weather. A strongly supported historical observation notes that emigrant wagon companies often relied heavily on animal behaviour during blizzards. Oxen sometimes sensed safe routes or sheltered ground better than exhausted travellers struggling through low visibility. By afternoon, snow has worked its way into nearly everything. Boots, blankets, gloves, food sacks. The wagon interior feels damp despite everyone's efforts to keep moisture outside. Snow melts slowly from coats hung near the bedding, leaving cold, wet patches everywhere. The father finally orders everyone inside the wagon while the oxen continue pulling forward through the storm. That creates a new problem immediately. Too many people. Too many wet layers. Too little space. The little girl sneezes because snowflakes continue blowing through tiny gaps in the canvas seams overhead. The little boy accidentally elbows a coffee pot while trying to remove frozen gloves. Somewhere beneath the bedding, your old enemy, the tool crate, attacks your knee again with determined frontier consistency. Outside, the storm intensifies. You can barely hear the other wagons now, except for occasional muffled shouting through the wind. One fascinating emigrant recollection tells of travellers tying ropes between wagons during heavy snowstorms, so people would not become lost while moving through camp after dark. Imagine needing navigation equipment simply to find breakfast. The wagon finally stops near sunset beside a shallow ravine offering slight protection from the wind. Slight, very slight. Still, the emigrants accept it gratefully. Fires become nearly impossible to maintain outside. Smoke blows sideways instantly while snow buries weak flames beneath drifting powder. Most families retreat into wagons earlier than usual, wrapped in blankets and buffalo robes. Inside your wagon, wet clothing hangs everywhere possible. The smell becomes extraordinary. Wet wool, leather, smoke, animal fur, snow melting from coats, human exhaustion. It feels less like a home and more like a travelling laundry argument. The father manages to light a tiny lantern near the wagon entrance, while snow taps steadily against the canvas roof. The little girl sleeps almost immediately from exhaustion, curled beneath two buffalo robes like a tiny hibernating animal. The little boy stays awake longer listening to the storm. So if the snow keeps falling forever, he whispers, do we just become part of the prairie? The father considers this carefully, then answers, only temporarily, fairly reassuring by frontier standards. Modern historians still examine how emigrants psychologically endured long periods of weather isolation during Western migration. Endless cold, confinement, uncertainty, and exhaustion affected travellers deeply, even when supplies remained adequate. Outside, the blizzard sweeps endlessly across the plains. Inside the crowded wagon, lantern light flickers across patched canvas and damp blankets, while snow piles higher against the wheels. Every traveller listens quietly to the storm surrounding them. Small warm breaths drifting upward beneath the freezing roof while the endless white prairie disappears completely into the night. When the fort finally appears through the melting snow, nobody trusts it at first. The wagon train crests a low ridge near midday, and there it stands beyond the frozen river. Wooden walls, smoke rising from chimneys, a scattering of buildings clustered behind rough stockades like something imagined after too many nights beneath canvas roofs. For several long seconds, the entire wagon company simply stares. Real walls. You almost forgot such things existed. The children react first. The little girl points excitedly toward the smoke. Her brother immediately asks whether forts contain pie. An excellent survival instinct, honestly. The father says nothing, but you notice how his shoulders lower slightly for the first time in days. A substantial body of historical evidence shows that forts and trading posts became vital resting points along many western migration routes. Travellers repaired wagons, traded supplies, received news, rested livestock, and occasionally enjoyed the shocking luxury of indoor shelter before continuing west. The fort itself looks unimpressive by modern standards. Rough timber walls darkened by weather, mud packed between logs, snow piled against corners, yet after weeks of sleeping inside freezing wagons, it resembles a palace constructed by extremely practical kings. The wagon train enters slowly through open gates. Immediately new smells surround you. Fresh bread, wood smoke trapped between buildings, horse manure warming in the sun, stew simmering somewhere nearby. Human civilization apparently smells remarkably similar to soup. Men move between the structures carrying barrels and firewood while bundled women shake rugs from upper windows. Dogs wander freely through muddy snow near the stable yards. Every sound feels strangely loud after endless open prairie. Hammering. Voices. Doors opening, shutting. A fiddle playing faintly somewhere indoors. The little girl spins once in excitement before slipping directly into mud beside the wagon wheel. The frontier remains committed to humility. The family rents space inside a crowded lodging room attached to the trading post for the night. Not private exactly. Several other emigrants already occupy corners of the long wooden room, yet the moment you step inside, warmth wraps around you almost painfully. Not fire warmth, building warmth, held warmth, the kind that stays trapped behind walls instead of vanishing instantly into prairie wind. You stand near the stove longer than necessary simply because you can. The room smells heavily of wet coats drying near heat. Wool, soup broth, pine smoke, leather boots lined beside the walls. Overhead beams creak softly while snow melts from the roof outside. One particularly charming frontier complaint appears in several fort journals. Travellers unused to sleeping indoors again, after months on the trail, sometimes found proper beds too soft at first. Imagine becoming so accustomed to wagon floors that mattresses begin feeling suspicious. The children stare openly at the bunk beds along one wall. Actual beds, narrow and crowded perhaps, but elevated from the floor and covered with straw mattresses that do not directly involve wagon axles. The mother runs her fingers briefly across one blanket, almost in disbelief. The father removes his boots beside the stove while steam rises visibly from his socks. Nobody comments on this because every single person in the room is currently drying something damp near the fire. Outside, snow continues falling lightly through the fort yard. Inside, voices murmur quietly while stew bowls pass between tired travellers. One man describes conditions farther west. Another discusses wagon repairs. Someone else claims river ice ahead has begun breaking early this season. A widely recognised historical pattern along frontier routes involved forts becoming temporary social centres where emigrants exchanged rumours, advice, warnings, and exaggerated stories gathered across enormous distances. The little boy eats stew with terrifying enthusiasm. After weeks of trail food, even ordinary broth tastes extraordinary indoors beside real walls. The stew itself contains beans, bits of salt pork, onions, and something that may once have held strong opinions about being a carrot. Perfect. The little girl falls asleep halfway through eating and nearly face plants directly into her bowl before the mother catches her gently. Exhaustion lingers deep inside everyone now that the journey has paused briefly. You notice strange details once the room quiets later that evening. No wind-shaking canvas overhead. No frost forming beside your face. No livestock sounds drifting through darkness. Instead, you hear wooden walls settling softly around the stove heat. Footsteps above. Distant laughter from another room. Snow sliding from the roof outside. A frontier anecdote recorded by one traveller tells of emigrant children becoming temporarily frightened inside proper buildings after long months on open trails, because silence indoors felt unnatural compared with wagon camps. The father stretches carefully across the bunk mattress after the lanterns dim. Immediately he frowns. Too soft. The mother laughs quietly into her blanket. You honestly understand him, though. The bed shifts strangely beneath your weight after weeks sleeping on packed quilts over wooden wagon floors. Your body almost misses the familiar creaks of the wagon and the steady sway of wind against canvas. Almost. Not entirely. Scholars continue discussing how temporary shelter stops affected emigrant morale during long migrations. Some accounts describe forts as emotional lifelines. Others mention tension, overcrowding, disease exposure, and rising expenses within these frontier outposts. Still, tonight feels peaceful, warm enough that you no longer sleep curled tightly beneath layers of buffalo robes, warm enough that moisture dries slowly from clothing hanging near the stove, warm enough that children dream deeply without coughing from freezing air. Outside the fort walls, snow drifts quietly across the endless plains, but inside the crowded little room, travellers rest beneath timber roofs and fading lantern light while stove warmth settles gently through the darkness, holding winter at bay for just one precious night before the long trail begins again. Morning, inside the fort, arrives with a kind of quiet you almost forgot existed, not the silence of open prairie nights, where wind fills every gap and distance feels endless, but a contained silence. Wooden walls holding the world in place, snow pressing gently outside, smoke already rising from chimneys like slow signals of waking life. You wake in a real bed and immediately feel slightly confused by your own good fortune. For a moment, your body expects the familiar ache of wagon floors, the uneven pressure of crates, the cold draft slipping through canvas seams. Instead, there is only a mattress that does not shift when someone breathes nearby. The sensation is almost suspicious. Downstairs, the fort is already awake. Boots on wood, pots clattering, voices exchanging prices, plans, and weather predictions with the calm urgency of people who have learned that winter never waits for politeness. The mother is already packing supplies again. Of course she is. Shelter or no shelter. The trail continues to demand preparation. She folds dried cloth, checks food stores, and reorganizes what feels like an entire household into increasingly efficient bundles. The father returns from outside carrying news about the wagon train departure schedule. It is time to move again. Even here, a mainstream historical fact is that trading forts and way stations were not destinations for emigrants, but pauses, temporary interruptions in long migrations westward. Wagons rarely stayed more than a day or two unless storms forced longer delays. The trail always resumed, no matter how comfortable the pause felt. The children protest immediately upon hearing this, especially the little girl. She has already decided indoor life is emotionally superior to outdoor suffering. The boy, however, is distracted by something far more important. A cat. It appears near the fort kitchen as if summoned by the concept of food itself. Thin, half wild, entirely unimpressed by human emotions. It circles the boy's legs briefly before disappearing again behind barrels. The boy is deeply changed by this encounter. Inside the room, emigrants gather for one last shared meal at the fort. Stew again, bread again, coffee again, but noticeably stronger than wagon coffee, which immediately raises questions about what exactly they were doing to frontier water before boiling it. Around the room, conversations turn quieter. People speak less about survival and more about direction. Routes ahead, river conditions, weather rumours drifting in from travellers arriving from the west. A curious tidbit recorded in frontier journals describes how some wagon companies developed temporary fort habits after short stays indoors, such as sitting too close together at tables or forgetting how loudly they had been speaking outside. Civilization, even briefly, recalibrated social behaviour. The father watches the wagon train preparing outside through a small window. Snow has softened overnight into a thin white layer across the ground. Wagons already stand in lines near the gates. Oxen breathe slowly into the cold air. Drivers tighten harnesses with practiced movements. No one looks fully rested, but everyone looks slightly more capable of continuing. The mother finishes packing with precise movements that suggest she has already mentally accounted for the next several hundred miles. You step outside the fort again. Cold air hits differently now, not the shock of pure exposure like before, but a familiar sensation returning after brief interruption. The prairie stretches wide beyond the fort walls, pale and endless beneath winter sky. Some scholars still debate whether brief stops at forts helped or hindered emigrant endurance in the long term. Some accounts suggest rest improved survival rates, while others note that comfort sometimes made departure emotionally harder, especially for children and exhausted adults. The wagon train begins moving out slowly through the gates. Wooden wheels creak across packed snow. Harness chains clink. Voices call out last instructions. The fort grows smaller behind you as the wagons roll away, shrinking into a cluster of timber walls and smoke rising into cold sky. The little girl watches it disappear with unmistakable sadness. The boy waves at the fort cat that does not wave back. By midday, the fort has gone entirely behind rolling terrain. The prairie opens again in every direction. Wind returns, space returns, distance returns, and with it, the familiar quiet pressure of being very small inside something very large. The wagons move steadily forward beneath pale sun. Snow crunches under wheels. Oxen leave deep tracks stretching backward into memory. The trail ahead remains uncertain, but at least now it is familiar uncertainty. Inside your wagon, blankets shift. Supplies settle. The buffalo robes still hold warmth from the fort, slowly fading with each passing mile. The father walks beside the wagon again, hands tucked into his coat, eyes forward into the winter horizon. The mother checks the children under blankets one more time. Everything resumes its familiar rhythm. Not comfortable, not easy, but moving. And on the frontier, movement itself becomes its own kind of survival. Outside, the prairie stretches endlessly ahead, beneath a sky that refuses to stay still for long, while behind you the fort becomes only a memory of walls, warmth, and a brief pause in a journey that never truly stops. The prairie becomes quieter after the fort disappears than it was before you ever reached it. That is the strange part nobody mentions in advance. You would expect comfort to linger, warm rooms, real beds, stew that does not taste faintly of survival decisions. Instead, the memory of it seems to sharpen the emptiness around you, as if the land notices what you briefly had and adjusts accordingly. Snow has returned in thin, scattered patches across the ground. Not a storm now, just the kind of lingering winter that refuses to fully leave anything alone. The wagon train moves in a long, uneven line across low-rolling country. Wheels creak through frozen mud. Oxen exhale steady clouds into cold air. Every sound feels slightly louder after the quiet walls of the fort. Inside your wagon, space feels both familiar and smaller at the same time. The buffalo robes are still warm from last night. The blankets still carry traces of stove heat, but the prairie has already begun drawing that warmth back out again through canvas seams and frozen air. The little boy sleeps again despite the movement. That alone feels like a minor miracle of frontier adaptation. His sister sits beside him watching the shifting world outside the wagon flap with quiet seriousness. She no longer comments on ghosts or wolves. Instead, she simply observes everything, as if trying to understand what kind of place would require so much travel without ever offering certainty in return. Ahead of the wagons, the trail narrows slightly through a shallow valley. The father walks beside the wagon for a while, then leans in briefly. There is something different in his expression today. Not relief, not exhaustion alone, something closer to calculation. You notice it in the way he looks at distance, at weather, at the remaining supplies stacked inside the wagon. Frontier travelers often developed an internal map that constantly updated without needing words, tracking water sources, grazing land, and approaching seasonal shifts long before official records ever confirmed them. A widely accepted historical fact is that emigrant wagon trains adjusted routes continuously based on terrain, water access, and weather conditions rather than fixed schedules. Flexibility was not optional. It was survival logic written into every mile of movement. The mother notices something too. She begins rationing quietly without announcing it. Small adjustments, slightly less food at midday, slightly more water at rest stops, clothing checked more carefully for wear along seams. Nothing dramatic, just constant awareness. The wagon passes a line of abandoned objects near the trail. At first they look like natural debris, then human. A broken chair frame half buried in snow, a warped bucket lying on its side, a length of canvas stiffened by frost. The little girl stares at them for a long time. Nobody explains. Some emigrants discarded items deliberately to lighten loads during difficult crossings. Others lost possessions accidentally during storms, river crossings, or wagon failures. The trail slowly accumulated fragments of lives that could not continue carrying everything forward. A peculiar tidbit from several frontier accounts mentions travellers sometimes leaving written notes inside abandoned wagons or crates, as if speaking to future strangers who might pass by. Messages like apologies, instructions, or simply names. You pass another broken wagon wheel partially embedded in frozen ground. It looks almost peaceful there, as if it simply decided to stop participating in movement. By late afternoon, the ski changes again. Clouds gather low and heavy, pressing down toward the horizon. Wind increases gradually, carrying a familiar tension that everyone in the wagon train recognizes immediately without needing to speak. The father walks closer beside the wagon again. The mother tightens blankets around the children. No one says the word storm, but everyone prepares for it anyway. Some scholars continue debating how emigrant groups interpreted environmental warning signs without modern forecasting tools. While some relied on experience and observation of wind patterns, animal behavior, and cloud formation, others recorded what appears in diaries as almost intuitive sensing of weather shifts long before visible change. The first gust arrives just before sunset. Not strong yet, but cold enough to change everything. Snow begins drifting sideways across the prairie within minutes. The wagon train slows, then slows further. By the time night arrives, the wagons are partially encircled in rising wind and scattered snow that glows faintly in fading light. You hear shouted instructions ahead. The wagons begin forming a tighter circle, a familiar pattern now. Wheels angled inward, oxen secured, canvas pulled tighter against frames. Fire pits established quickly where possible, though the wind makes flames difficult to maintain. Inside your wagon, everything shifts into preparation mode without panic. Blankets redistributed, food checked, lantern filled, water secured so it will not freeze in exposed containers. The little boy wakes briefly and asks if the wind is angry. The father answers after a pause. Not angry, just weather. The answer seems to calm him more than any reassurance about safety would. Night settles quickly. Too quickly. The storm strengthens as darkness arrives, pressing against wagon canvas with steady force. Snow begins accumulating along the outer edges of the wagons, forming pale ridges that slowly reshape the circle. Inside, the wagon feels smaller again. Not from space, from awareness. Every sound becomes more noticeable. Canvas flexing, wind pushing, oxen shifting outside. Occasional calls between wagons carried and distorted through gusts. The mother checks the children again. The father remains near the wagon opening, listening. Outside, someone shouts something about securing ropes. Then another voice answers. Then the wind takes most of it. A quirky frontier detail appears in many overland diaries, describing how wagon trains sometimes sang or called out to one another during storms, simply to maintain awareness of group cohesion. Sound became a form of location and reassurance when visibility failed completely. The lantern inside your wagon flickers. Snow taps continuously against canvas now, not soft anymore. Persistent. The little girl has fallen asleep again, tightly wrapped beneath buffalo robes. The boy remains half awake, listening to the storm like it is telling a long, incomprehensible story. You realize something quietly. The fort feels very far away now, not in distance. In memory, Warm walls, indoor silence, and steady floors already begin dissolving into something unreal, compared with the constant motion of wagons, wind, and weather. Outside, the prairie storm intensifies further, surrounding the wagon train in moving darkness and snow, while the small circle of wagons holds together beneath the pressure of winter, carrying forward through a night that refuses to become still. The storm does not end during the night. It only changes rhythm. By the time you wake, it has become a steady presence rather than an event. Wind pressing across the wagons, snow drifting in constant pale sheets, the entire world reduced to motion and cold sound. Inside the wagon, everything feels slightly rearranged again. That is the quiet truth of sleeping inside a covered wagon during winter travel. Nothing ever stays exactly where you left it. Blankets shift, breath freezes along canvas, heat gathers and disappears in uneven pockets depending on how bodies settle through the night. The little girl is still asleep. The boy's awake now, unusually calm, watching the dim outline of canvas above him as snowlight filters through in faint grey patterns. The father is already outside. Of course he is. You hear his voice occasionally through the wind, calling to the oxen, or responding to other wagons that are only barely visible through drifting snow. The mother checks the bedding slowly. Everything's slightly damp again. Not soaked. Just enough moisture to remind everyone that winter is still fully present and not particularly interested in negotiation. A mainstream historical fact is that winter travel across the American plains often continued despite severe storms because wagon trains had limited seasonal windows for reaching destinations before rivers thawed or resources ran out. Delays could mean far greater danger later in the journey. You step outside briefly. The cold hits immediately, sharper than last night. The prairie is almost entirely erased again beneath white movement. Wagons appear as darker shapes barely holding form through the storm. Oxen stand like frozen silhouettes steaming into the wind. Sound is reduced to fragments. Wood creaking. Wind dragging across open land. Occasional shouted coordination between wagons. The father gestures for you to return quickly. Inside again. The wagon feels warmer by comparison, though still far from comfortable. Buffalo robes hold heat stubbornly beneath layers of exhaustion and shared breath. The little boy finally speaks quietly. He asks how far the trail still is. No one answers immediately. That question changes shape depending on weather. Injuries, lost time, and routes adjusted for conditions. Distance on the frontier is never a fixed number. It behaves more like something alive, stretching and contracting depending on circumstance. Eventually the father replies, "Far enough. Not discouraging, not hopeful, just honest in a way that feels strangely grounding." A quirky tidbit from emigrant journals describes travellers marking progress not only in miles but in emotional milestones, such as surviving first river crossings, first major snowstorm, or first wagon repair failure. Distance became something measured in endurance rather than geography. Outside, the wind strengthens again. Snow presses harder against the wagon sides. The canvas groans softly under shifting weight. But the wagon holds. It continues holding in the same way it has held every night before this one, stitched together by repairs, luck, and stubborn necessity. The mother wraps the children again beneath buffalo robes. The father returns briefly, snow clinging to his coat and beard. He pauses before sitting down, looks at everyone inside, not with celebration, not with relief, something quieter, recognition. Scholars still debate whether emigrant wagon travel should be understood primarily as hardship or adaptation, whether survival depended more on endurance or on the ability to constantly adjust expectations downward without losing purpose entirely. The lantern inside the wagon burns low. Outside, the storm continues to erase and rebuild the prairie in shifting white layers. Inside, breathing slows again. Warmth gathers where bodies are close. Canvas flexes softly under wind. The little girl sleeps. The boy sleeps. Even the exhausted silence feels temporary, as if the next movement of weather might rewrite everything again. The wagon train continues forward through the storm, not because the path is easy, but because stopping offers no better alternative. Wheels turn slowly beneath snow. Oxen push through drifting white. Wagons follow one another into a landscape that never fully reveals what lies ahead. And inside one small covered wagon, wrapped in buffalo robes and fading lantern light, a family sleeps through the moving cold, carried forward across an endless winter prairie that stretches far beyond sight, far beyond certainty, and far beyond the fragile canvas that holds them together. Sweet dreams.